live tonight. We have a jam-packed show planned for you tonight, and as you can see, it's a lot going on. We see the protests going on across the country that were spurred by the killing of George Floyd that took place Memorial Day 2020, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back, as many people are saying. That's not the only reason why people are protesting. That's basically the latest reason why. There's a convergence of things that are taking place, whether we deal with coronavirus and we deal with health disparities, economic disparities. We're dealing with white supremacy and racism. We're dealing with Donald Trump's tweets inflaming people also. So we're dealing with a number of different things. And as the mayor of Minneapolis, Minnesota said, he referenced 400 years of racism also. So we have a jam-packed show for you all tonight. And we're broadcasting on my Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network, and my personal page, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP, on YouTube as well. We have a special guest also at the beginning of the show, waiting for him to call in. You've seen him on MSNBC and I think CNN as well. We're going to be joined very shortly by Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist.
And Mr. Imhotep, we actually do have him on hold for whenever you're ready.
Oh, okay. Well, if he's on hold right now, we can't hold the good brother, Lieutenant Governor. So, welcome to the African History Network show, Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist. How you doing today, brother?
I'm doing well. It's an honor to be here with you.
Oh, thank you, man. Thank you. Well, look, I've been watching your career, and we're glad that you're up in Lansing fighter for us also. So I know you have a very special message for our listeners. So what was it that you wanted to brief us on tonight?
Well, again, thank you for having me to be able to connect with you and your listeners. And, you know, this is just a moment that I think so many people across our state, across the city of Detroit, where I live, where I'm calling from, where I grew up for the first half of my childhood, we're thinking about how exhausting, how emotionally, mentally, physically exhausting it is to be Black in America. We're thinking about everyone from W.E.B. Du Bois to James Baldwin, who articulated the duality of our identity and how much work it is to hold our identities. And in this moment, when we have these matters coming to a head again in the context of this global pandemic that has been deadlier to our people and communities of color broadly than there has been to white people, when we're in this moment where police brutality, which is unfortunately not a new phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon that has been placed front and center again because we saw George Floyd murdered by police in broad daylight in front of people without any compunction or any hesitation. When we see just people needing to speak out, needing to cry out because we have a generation of people who have felt unheard and not responded to. I just wanted to come and share that as a person who has had these experiences, as someone who has been unlawfully pulled over, as someone who has been hemmed up, as someone who has lost friends in situations like this, I want folks to know that, representation matters when it comes to leadership. And I hear you, and I see you, and I've been that. And what we're working toward now is how we go beyond that, how we overcome this, how we put in place a different system that actually enables us to be hopeful and to strive and not to live in fear and live in looking over our shoulder. And the thing that's empowering, and this is a message I shared, I joined a demonstration of young faith leaders in the city of Detroit here at Dexter and Davidson earlier today with Reverend Powell across the street from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which happens to be the first church I attended when my mother grew up, where my grandma still goes, et cetera. And in that parking lot, we had a beautiful demonstration of people in their cars and people social distance outside, and everybody was wearing masks because we are still living in this pandemic. But we wanted to speak up, and the message that I shared this morning was that as we are demonstrating and we are crying out, the thing that's empowering to me about how we move forward is that the systems that are in place today, they weren't always there. They were not ordained by God. Those systems were not in Genesis, right? Like, those systems were created by men. They were created by people who made a set of choices to put in place this set of systems. And my training as a community organizer, which I spent part of my career doing that work for racial, social, and economic justice, shows that a different set of people, a more empowered set of people, a more diverse set of people, a larger set of people, a more broad set of people, a more inspired set of people can put in place make a different set of choices and put in place a different system. And that is the aspiration, I believe, of what all of us are crying out for. And so I certainly support and appreciate people who are speaking up to demand justice. I condemn those who are working to co-opt this call for justice in order to sow discord and destruction under the cover of a just fight. That we have had situations in Detroit and Grand Rapids where we've seen destruction, and that has not come from people who are seeking justice. That has come from people who have come to sow discord and are there for different reasons. They do not have the best interests of justice at their heart, and it's problematic, and it really angers me to my core to see people work to co-opt a movement that really is about the beautiful struggle that we all are working to get beyond. And so I just wanted to share that.
Just one quick minute, Lieutenant Governor. Let me just let people know. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
We have people that just joined us, and we have people. I have 1 million followers on my Facebook fan page, the African History Network. So we have people around the world listening. So I'm speaking with Lieutenant Governor of the state of Michigan, Garlin Gilchrist. That's who's speaking right now. Go ahead, Lieutenant Governor.
Yeah. So I just wanted to share that. I think in this moment we are working to put in place structures in Michigan. Here as Lieutenant Governor, certainly in my tenure after being elected to this position in 2018, we've been working to actually address poverty from the state level in a way that it's never had before by reorganizing state governments' anti-poverty efforts to sharpen them, work to improve quality of life in cities. I led a tour called Thriving Cities that started in Detroit and went to 19 cities across the state, Benton Harbor, Flint, Saginaw, Muskegon, Marquette, Port Huron, everywhere, to talk to people where, and a lot of people of color, a lot of black folks in Michigan mostly live in cities. And so how can we help to improve quality of life, increase generational economic opportunity, fight for environmental justice, increase access to transportation and mobility and quality of life for kids in cities, and all of these things. We're working to build on that. I'm chairing the Michigan Coronavirus Taskforce on Racial Disparities that Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's been a tremendous ally to the community, asked me to lead that effort because we recognized, we measured, we got the data, and now we have something to respond to how and why this virus has been so deadly to our people. We're ready to step up. And this is a collective standing up and standing tall in communities, not just across Michigan, but this is a national and international. We have brothers and sisters in Hong Kong who are protesting in solidarity and all around the world. And so I think in this collective moment, we need to recognize the power that we have. We need to recognize that we can wield that power in a way that doesn't put us at risk when it comes to the coronavirus that we're still trying to search for a treatment and a vaccine for that we don't have. So we have to be careful. But being careful does not mean we compromise the power we can build.
Let me ask you a quick question. I know you're short on time. The state of Michigan was one of the first states to have the task force dealing with coronavirus and studying the health disparities, and African Americans make up about 40% of the fatalities in the state of Michigan. What can we look forward to from that, and what stage are you all now in the research?
Absolutely. Well, let's take it even a step back from that. So Michigan was one of the first states and still remains one of the few states that has collected and reported its coronavirus test results and COVID-19 deaths along demographic lines that included race and ethnicity. That's really important because you cannot respond to or solve a problem that you cannot measure. And so we observed that, and once we observed those disparities were present and persisted, which wasn't necessarily surprising, but we needed to understand the depth of it to design a response to it. That's when we became the first state, and still the only state that has a full-throated, full force of the state government task force that is empowered to address the immediate challenge of the differentiated mortality rate, but also connect to the longer-term work to invest in solutions to health disparities based upon racial lines. So here's some of the things that the task force has done. We've greatly expanded the testing protocol for people who are eligible to get a test. This has been happening in lockstep with the fact that our testing capacity in the state has increased tremendously. And under the leadership of our chief medical executive, Dr. Jonae Caldoun, a black woman. By the way, we have the most diverse leadership team responding to coronavirus in the country here in Michigan, Dr. Caldoun, myself, and Governor Whitmer. And so we have made it so that more people can get tested in more places. Today, I went to 2 additional new targeted due to the demographics of the neighborhood drive-through testing sites that are serving specifically communities of color and black communities in particular, actually, in Albion and in Westland. The state of Michigan innovated this drive-through testing model that's been replicated across the country. And thanks to this task force and the members on it, we found a way to hotspot and target specifically where the testing capacity needs to go. So we're deploying that across the state. We had 6 new communities have those testing sites happen, and we tested more than 3,500 people got tested in those sites just in the last day and a half. So that's important because
so 3,500 people. Let me just repeat what you said. 3,500 people got tested when?
In these drive-through testing sites in the last day and a half, focused particularly in communities of color that have been hardest hit. These are the places where we know this testing is most needed in communities of color. And the reason that's important is because testing is the front door to treatment. And when people were denied testing, they were denied treatment. When they were denied testing early because we didn't have the constraint, that may have been due to medical bias in those testing decisions. And that's why the task force also works with Dr. Caldoun to write a letter to every medical provider in the state to let them know that medical bias may be present. And that's following the research that shows that you address medical bias by naming medical bias in order to help overcome it. Another thing we're working on is the fact that we've had so many people who've had to work this entire time but are not safe when they're working because there are many protocols when you're a bus driver or you're a sanitation worker or you're a grocery store worker or you're a frontline healthcare worker or you're an administrative person who's working behind the scenes at a desk at a hospital or at an urgent care facility. How do we make sure that you are safe and protected at work? We're working on solutions to deliver food to people for whom it's hard to it's not safe for them to leave their homes to get food. We're working on solutions for isolation for people for whom it's hard to isolate because you may live in a small place, only have 1 bedroom or 1 bathroom, or may have a multi-generational family in one household. So this is the infrastructure that we're putting in place with the task force, and really it's work that isn't happening at that scale in other parts of the country, and so we hope that this is a national model.
Okay, excellent. How can people get more information on all of this and the assistance? And I know there may be still people trying to apply for unemployment and things like this in the state of Michigan. What should people do?
So for information about the pandemic in Michigan, people can go to michigan.gov/coronavirus, and you'll see all the latest information and resources about the pandemic and how we are responding, the actions that we've taken, the information about the task force, the meeting minutes and the videos and the agendas and all that stuff. You'll see that there. Related to unemployment insurance.
Michigan.gov/coronavirus. Michigan.gov/coronavirus. Yes, go ahead.
That's right. And then for other services, michigan.gov/UIAs, where people can go to apply for unemployment insurance. We have added a great deal of capacity. We have another 400 people that we're adding starting tomorrow answering the phones because so many people have had to file. Michigan has set up our system to be able to accept self-employed people and gig economy workers and Uber drivers or DoorDash delivery people or whatever we set up. We're still one of the few states that has done that. We also are set up for people to be able to draw down the additional $600 per week from the federal government. And so we're asking people to please apply and know that you will get your full unemployment benefit that is retroactive to the date of your eligibility, not when you actually are able to get through the system. That's really important to make that distinction. So if people call, they're not able to get through.
Say that again, Lieutenant Governor.
So when you apply for unemployment, there's a date at which you are eligible, the date where you got furloughed or where you needed to file for unemployment. When you apply and you give that date, your benefits will be effective on that date, regardless of, let's say, you call and you're not able to get through and you need to call back again. You will not be penalized because you had to call back in because the system, we weren't able to accommodate you at that time. We will work to accommodate you, but we will also make sure that you will get your full benefit and all of the money that is yours. So people, please be aware of that. Please work with us. And like I said, we're adding capacity to the system every day, redeploying people from other parts of state government because we know this is urgent for people and for families and for households that need these monies to continue to get by as we respond to this global pandemic in our state.
Absolutely. Once again, Michigan.gov /coronavirus and then Michigan.gov. What was the other one for unemployment?
/UIA for Unemployment Insurance Agency, UIA.
Michigan.gov /UIA. All right. Well, look, Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist, brother, we appreciate your work and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come on the African History Network show to share this information with us. And this is an example of how politics impacts every aspect of our life, also from the water we drink to the air we breathe to the food we eat. This is why politics and laws and policies are so important.
Can I say something on that point? Because I think you just said something that's really important.
I know we're coming up on the break, but how much time we have before the break, JT?
We actually have to go right now, so if you can wrap things up.
Okay, go ahead and wrap things up. Just think probably about a minute.
Okay, just really quickly, everything that we're dealing with that you pointed out are the consequences of politics, the consequences of not competing, of participating in the census and all these sorts of things. That's what you just said is really important, and want to make sure that this is not the moment for people to be disengaged in any decision-making process or any political process. So everyone, please step up, be counted, vote, just stand tall.
And the census, fill out the census form too. Okay, brother. Take care. Have a good night, okay?
Thank you. God bless you. Stay safe.
All right, brother. Peace.
All right, you listen to the African History Network show right here on 910 AM, the Superstation, the Future Radio. I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep. We'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, stand by, everybody. That was, we're on commercial break. That was Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist of the state of Michigan. So I had to do that interview. He wanted to come in at the top of the show. We're on 910 AM, the Superstation WFDF. I've been doing radio here in Detroit for 4 years. So I don't just broadcast here on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network, and my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep. We're broadcasting on real radio in Detroit, not internet radio. This is terrestrial radio with the FCC license. 910 AM, the Superstation WFDF here in Detroit. So I got the call from the station manager this evening that Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist, who's an African-American man, wanted to come on my show tonight and talk about what's going on. Okay, so we're on commercial break. We'll be back in a couple minutes. Everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in. When we come back, we'll deal with George Floyd and the virus of racism, Donald Trump, the fear of the browning of America. We're going to deal with a lot. I got a ton of information. I have 3 pages of written notes. We're going to do an update on what's going on right now. The protests taking place, the curfews in place. There's a curfew in the city of Detroit for 8 p.m. because of what happened the Friday night and Saturday night here in the city of Detroit with the protests and things like this. And we have a lot of people coming from outside of the city of Detroit, outside the state of Michigan, protesting and getting involved in violent protests, getting involved in trying to smash windows, things like this. And people in Detroit who are activists and protesters, they're saying, wait a second, hold on, we're not trying to do all this. What are you doing? Welcome back to the African History Network show right here on 910 AM, the Superstation, the Future Radio. Hey, I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep. It is Sunday, May 31st, 2020, and we are live. I just finished speaking with Lieutenant Governor of the state of Michigan, Garlin Gilchrist. So we had that interview. Sorry for those watching on Facebook Live and YouTube. It was a little hard to hear. I had him on speakerphone. We'll try to re-air the interview later that's more audible. But welcome to tonight's show. Look, we have a lot going on, and I have a ton of information to share. And at the same time, I don't want this show to be all doom and gloom. I really, really don't, because this is the first time I've spoken. This is the first time I've spoken publicly about the murder of George Floyd. Okay. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was too angry to speak publicly. Okay, so let's do this. Get your pens and pads ready. I'm going to deal with a lot of information. I'm going to switch back and forth between my handwritten notes because I have 3 pages of handwritten notes. And I've got about, 40 articles and about 6 video clips. Okay, so let's do an update on what's taking place right now. I've been reading the updates from the Washington Post, and I've been posting some articles. Follow us on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network, and my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, Imhotep. So government officials, law enforcement officers, and protesters in cities across the United States are preparing for a 6th night of mass demonstrations after George Floyd, an African-American man, was killed in police custody in Minneapolis, Minnesota on Memorial Day 2020. Now, we know it was a heinous, gruesome killing. His humanity was not respected. This ties right into white supremacy and racism. One of the things I'm going to do tonight is give you a historical working definition of racism, because unfortunately many people don't understand what racism is. All right, let's continue. So peaceful protests began in the Twin Cities and rapidly spread to metropolitan areas across rural and urban America, escalating in numbers and force as some demonstrators and law enforcement officers began to clash. The National Guard was mobilized, buildings were burned, and businesses looted. Civilians have been placed under curfew by government officials and fired upon with rubber bullets, pepper pellets, and tear gas by authorities in riot gear. Hundreds have been arrested. Now, there was one article from the Washington Post that talks about how at least at around 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this evening, police had arrested 2,564 people in 24 U.S. cities over this weekend, according to a tally by the Washington Post. Nearly a fifth of those arrests were in the city of Los Angeles. Charges including violating curfew, but also burglary and damaging property. On Sunday night, May 31st, 2020, protests and arrests could escalate as cities increasingly enforce curfews and set them earlier. Now, as Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, has talked about, as former Assistant FBI Director Frank Figliuzzi, who's a contributor to NBC, as he's talked about as recently as today, and others, there is another force that is interjecting themselves into these protests all across the country. It is a white supremacist force. And then also you have anarchists and things like this who are coming in to purposely do destruction. They're not part of the main protesters who are angry about what happened to George Floyd, or angry what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, or angry about what happened to Breonna Taylor and things like this. It's another force that is using the anger, the justified anger of African Americans, as a cover to come in and disrupt, do destruction, agitate, well, not agitate, to really force confrontations with police and things like this. And you have protesters on the ground saying, we don't know who these people are. You have protesters on the ground saying, wait a second, this is not what we're about. We don't know who these people are. Then you have other people who are coming in, don't live in these cities, don't live in the city of Detroit, coming in just wanting to start stuff. They may not be anarchists. They may not be white supremacists, things like this. They just come in. You know, there was an incident. You know, now Pastor Mo, whose show comes on after mine. Listen to Pastor Mo. I know he's going to talk about this. He was at the press conference today with Mayor Mike Duggan, the mayor of Detroit, and they were talking about what happened last night downtown Detroit. And I live downtown. I was downtown, man. I saw all these police cars and things like this, all these protesters, and a lot of these protesters are white. And I know gentrification is going on in downtown Detroit, well, in Detroit, period. Especially downtown Detroit. I don't know where all these white people come from. You know, and I was downtown today. I was out, and I posted on my Facebook fan page who's organizing this protest in downtown Detroit today, because I see all these white people down there. It's about 80% white at this protest, and they're carrying Black Lives Matter signs and things like this. Now, it's good to have allies. Don't get me wrong, because during slavery, you had white abolitionists who risked their lives to help African Americans escape to freedom and help end slavery. I understand that. But I asked about 30 people, who's organizing? I was downtown. I'm walking away from the protest because I didn't intend to protest. I was headed somewhere else. But I'm walking away from the protest. I see all these people walk to the protest, most of them white. Okay? I asked about 30 people. It's about five of them were Hispanics. They had signs, you know, Black Lives Matter, things like this. That's good. We need allies. That's true. I'm not against that. Legitimate allies. I'm not against legitimate allies. I saw 2 African Americans. The African Americans, they were women. I asked them, they were walking with white people, and I asked everybody in the groups, especially the African Americans, y'all going to the protest? Yeah. Who's organizing this protest? Nobody could tell me. So I'm sitting here and I'm looking at this. Now, I'm a historian, right? And I'm looking at all you know, everybody wearing masks, you know, because of COVID-19, things like this. And I don't want people to take this the wrong way. I don't want this to sound crazy, but I don't remember reading about too many stories about white people with masks that turn out well for black people. I'm just saying. Now, I'm not saying many of them didn't mean well. I know. I talked to some of them. I talked to some of the white people. There was one white woman who was parking a car. She looked like she's in the medical field. I asked her, "You going to the protest?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Who's the organizer protest?" She said she didn't know, but she wanted to come support. I understand that you do have white people who legitimately think what happened to George Floyd as well as Ahmaud Arbery is wrong, and they want to participate. That's understandable. What I'm telling black people is, if you in a crowd like that and something jump off, and it's like 80% white, you're going to stick out. You're going to be the first one the police grab. So I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying know what it is that you're going to. I don't know who organized it. They may have good intentions. I'm not saying they don't. I'm saying you need to be careful, because you're going to be the first ones they grab. And what's happening is, in different cities, this may not have happened tonight, but in different cities, I'm watching this play out. What's happening is people outside don't live in the city, don't live in the state. A lot of them don't live in the city, in these various cities that these protests take place in. They come in, they start throwing rocks and bricks and all this stuff. Then they run behind the legitimate protesters, mix in with them, and the legitimate protesters get arrested. Or now they, you know, so you have to be careful. Because there's some people who mix in with these groups, mix in with the real protesters, and play on the sheer legitimate anger of African Americans for their own destructive purposes, not to help our cause at all. Okay? I'm not saying that's all white people, or they could be black for that matter. You know, whatever. Okay, so we have to be careful with this. And I've posted articles dealing with this on my Facebook fan page, the African History Network, as well. So let me try to get through this stuff as best I can, because I have a ton of information here. And for some of this, I'm just going to give you the names of articles for you to go read this yourself for the sake of time, okay? All right. How's everybody doing? Actually, there's one from BuzzFeed.com. Black protesters, BuzzFeedNews.com. Black protesters who want to demonstrate peacefully are calling out white people who instigate violence. Okay? And I'm seeing a number of things dealing with this. Okay? Now, I think it's important to make a distinction between lawful protests and peaceful protests. Okay, I don't like using the term peaceful protest. I like using the term lawful protest. What I mean by that is you can protest and be loud and still be lawful, not breaking any law. You don't have to protest and be silent, because a lot of times when some people, not all people, a lot of times when people say peaceful protests, a lot of times they want black people to suffer in silence. You can be lawful. I'm not telling people go out and break the law with protest. You can be lawful, but still be loud. You don't have to be silent. Okay? Because sometimes the term peaceful protest is used as duct tape to symbolically put on the mouths of protesters because they want black people to suffer in silence. Black protesters who want to demonstrate peacefully are calling out white people who instigate violence. Quote, when we aren't asking people to destroy things in our name and people do it anyway, we know that is something that's going to blow back on us, one black activist told BuzzFeed News. Read this article. This is from May 30th, 2020 by Clarissa Jan Lim, Janlim. Tay Anderson wanted Friday's protests against police brutality in Denver, Colorado to be peaceful. Quote, we ask people throughout the day, please do not deface property. Please do not destroy stuff, because we're not asking you to do that, end quote. Tay Anderson, who's a Denver school board director and activist, told BuzzFeed News. Still, with hundreds taken to the streets for the second day of demonstrations against the killing of George Floyd, an African-American man who died after Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin put him in a knee chokehold, had his knee on him for almost 9 minutes, just cruel and inhumane. He wouldn't do that to a dog, at least I don't think. You know, who knows, but I don't think Derek Chauvin would treat a dog like that. But for the second day of demonstrations against the killing of George Floyd, there was vandalism and clashes with Denver police, who fired tear gas and flashbangs into the crowd. Now, in a video that has been shared online widely, Tay Anderson, who is African American, is seen confronting a white man with a cloth covering on his face after the man spray paints ACAB. All cops are just another B word, not the first B word you think about, the other B word. Okay, born out of wedlock, that B word. Okay, so this white man with a cloth covering on his face spray paints ACAB on public property. Now, activist Tay Anderson said he was doing a news interview when he saw the man vandalizing, so he turned around and tried to stop him. He said, we asked allies to step back so that we can make sure that you're following what we're asking you to do, he recalled. And he was like, I'm not your ally. You guys want to protect the status quo. I don't need to be here for you all. Okay? And a lot of the activists ain't trying to protect the status quo. They're trying to change what's happening. But at the same time, they don't want all this stuff to blow back on them. And what happens is you have people coming in that don't live in that community, may not even live in that state, coming in, causing confrontations, defacing property, and then they go back to where they live. And then you have to deal with the repercussions. So we have to be careful. We have to be strategic with this and careful with this. And you know, I was looking at what's happened. There was a picture that was on social media from Friday. I think it was either Friday night or Saturday, maybe Saturday night here in Detroit, where you got some white people about to throw a rock or a brick through the window of the Nike store downtown. And it's Detroiters saying, wait, what are you doing? That's not what we're trying to do. That's not what we're about. And you have to ask yourself the question, wait a second. Why are you getting in your car driving across 8 Mile to come into Detroit to destroy property? Why are you doing that here? You don't live here. Why are you doing that here? It's one thing to want to legitimately protest because you're calling out white supremacy and racism, things like that. It's another thing to come into Detroit and do what you ain't doing in your own community. The reason why they do that is because they don't respect Detroit. See, they respect their own community. I'm not saying you should vandalize property in your own community. I'm not calling for anybody to do that. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. The question I'm asking is, why are you getting in your car or somebody else's car or carpooling, okay, because you want to save the environment, right? Carpooling to come across 8 Mile to come into Detroit to destroy property and vandalize. The reason why they ain't doing that in their community is because they respect where they live. They don't respect Detroit and Detroiters, because if they did, they wouldn't do that. You're not helping. You know, I was driving by downtown Detroit right before you get to Lodge Freeway, right before Joe Louis Arena. It's now TCF, was Joe Louis Arena, right? Named after a black man. Now it's named after a white corporation. That's a whole nother show. And then I see a group, you know, white protesters. They got signs, F the police and things like this. I'm like, oh, okay, y'all having some NWA fantasies or something up in here? Is that what it's about? Okay. All right. Read the article from Click on Detroit. That's Channel 4, WDIV in Detroit. This deals with Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan announces curfew for city as unrest continues. 84 people arrested while protesting on Saturday, May 30th, Saturday night in Detroit. So, and let me just say, there's a difference in general between the daytime protests in a lot of these cities, including and mainly in Detroit also. We see it in Detroit. There's a difference between the daytime protests and the nighttime protests, okay? Because the nighttime protests is usually where you have the problems, or the majority of the problems. It's usually the nighttime protests. Usually the daytime protests is, you know, pretty cool. People may be loud, they may cuss, something like that, right? But it's not people just going crazy and buck wild. Mayor Mike Duggan announced a curfew for the city of Detroit that begins the evening, so Sunday evening from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m., adding that it doesn't apply to people going to or from work. He said, I have issued an order, and okay, hold on, this pop-up came up, okay. I have the sign up for email with, email newsletter with Channel 4. I have issued an order, and as of this evening, there will be a curfew in the city of Detroit at 8 p.m. It will go from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. and throughout the city, people cannot be on public streets or in public areas, Mayor Mike Duggan said. The announcement was made during a press conference on Sunday, May 31st, while Mayor Mike Duggan and Police Chief James Craig, and I saw James Craig was interviewed by Chuck Todd on MSNBC. We may be able to get to that clip. I think that JT, did I send you that clip of Police Chief James Craig on MSNBC? Let me know. And police chiefs across the country have denounced what Officer Derek Chauvin and the other officers did, especially Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck. They called it murder. Police chiefs across the country, including our own Police Chief James Craig of Detroit Police Department. Okay. So the announcement was made during a press conference Sunday while Mayor Mike Duggan and Police Chief James Craig were providing an update regarding the recent unrest and protests over the death of George Floyd. Quote, if you come to Detroit and commit criminal acts, you will be arrested, end quote, said Police Chief James Craig speaking at the press conference on Sunday. Demonstrators plan to protest at Detroit Public Safety Headquarters beginning 4 p.m. So that was taking place before Sunday. I think maybe that's what I saw, one of the protests. I think that's what I saw. I still don't know who organized it, though. If you are worried about how to get to or from your job tonight, DDOT buses will still be running, Mayor Mike Duggan said. Okay. Now, on Friday, Duggan says the curfew is not intended for city residents. He said the curfew is not intended for city residents. On Friday and Saturday, the majority of protesters participating in demonstrations were from cities outside of Detroit. On Friday night, 60 people were arrested while protesting in downtown Detroit. That number increased to 84 arrests Saturday night. Mayor Mike Duggan and Police Chief James Craig also addressed the unrest Saturday at a press conference. All right, and read the rest of this article. This reminds me, there was a report from the Metro Times. Metro Times is a news publication here in Metro Detroit. There was one from about maybe 7-8 years ago. And it was called, I think it was called "Who's Buying Sex in Detroit?" Something like that. Who's buying sex in Detroit? And what they did was they looked at the people who were coming into Detroit buying prostitutes, and a lot of times they buy drugs also. And they said from the reporting, it's like about 50% of the people had addresses outside of Detroit, didn't live in Detroit. Cars registered outside Detroit, addresses outside Detroit, didn't live in Detroit. They're coming into Detroit to commit crimes. Now, people may say, well, hey, they're just buying drugs, picking up prostitutes. They're not killing anybody. That's true, they're not killing anybody, but they're contributing to nuisances. Okay? And this takes me back to the great Mayor Coleman Alexander Young. When he became mayor, took the oath of office January 1974, he told the drug dealers and the pushers to hit 8 Mile. So for those that don't know, because we have people all across the country, 8 Mile is the border of Detroit. The 8 Mile Road is the border that separates Detroit from the suburbs. Okay, especially at that time they were largely white suburbs. Now they're more, integrated. And if you saw the movie 8 Mile about Eminem, that's where 8 Mile comes from, 8 Mile Road. Okay, that's what that is. But you have to wonder, say, why are you crossing 8 Mile to come into Detroit to do all this? Okay. All right. Okay, so let's continue. All right, because I don't have a whole lot of time here, and then we'll probably continue after we do 2 hours here on the 10 a.m. Superstation. We're going to continue some of my social media platforms for a little while longer. We'll see how much energy I have tonight, because this has been a very busy and trying week. Okay, I'm just saying. All right, so let's continue with the update of what's going on here. So almost a week after George Floyd's death on Memorial Day, it remains unclear whether tensions nationwide are calming or escalating. Now, in times like this, you need real leadership coming from the White House. We don't have real leadership coming from the White House. We have a 2-year-old throwing temper tantrums on Twitter. We have a 2-year-old throwing temper tantrums on Twitter and instigating. Okay, and this ties into history. This fool, and I swear to God, I warned people about this idiot in 2016, and y'all didn't want to listen to me. You wanted to do economic empowerment, invest in the stock market and all this stuff, and I said that's fine, and you still need to take your black ass out and vote. Because you don't understand, politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties that adopts interpretation and enforcement. And what Trump has done is reverse the policies that the Obama administration put in place to deal with policing. Trump has reversed that, and the Trump administration has taken largely a hands-off approach to policing. This is what I was explaining to people in 2016. And now you see what I'm talking about. Trump ran on a platform of law and order. It wasn't just immigration and build the wall. If you go back and listen to him, and I was doing nationally syndicated radio 5 days a week in 2016. I was covering this daily. I wasn't only doing nationally syndicated radio, I was also doing radio here in Detroit on 910 a.m. the Superstation 2 days a week. The morning show, Thursday mornings. I was on the morning show and then doing my show Sunday night. I'm reporting on this stuff daily. And I remember vividly, News1.com has this article where Mike Pence, who was the governor of Indiana, he was running as vice president. Mike Pence was asked a question, and Mike Pence said, Donald Trump and I think that there is too much talk about implicit bias in policing. We need to stop talking about that. Really? That's what you think, Governor Mike Pence? NBCnews.com has this article from May 29th, 2020. Trump warns, when looting starts, shooting starts. As fires burn in Minneapolis. When looting starts, shooting starts. As fires burn in Minneapolis. Where does this term come from? This is a term from a segregationist mayor in 1967 in Miami. Okay? I think there was Mayor Headley. We'll pull up an article that deals more with this. But NBCnews.com has an article dealing with where does the term, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, where does that term come from? And that deals with going back to riots, rebellions, going back to 1967 and 1967 was known as the Long Hot Summer. 1967 was known as the Long Hot Summer. In 1967, there were 159 violent uprisings in this country. We had the Detroit Rebellion. You had Newark, New Jersey. You had all these rebellions that took place, okay, in 1967. And that's going to lead to President Lyndon Johnson organizing what's known as the Kerner Commission, okay, the Commission on Civil, National Commission on Civil Disorders, to analyze why are these rebellions taking place, what can be done to keep them from happening. We're going to talk some about that because the results, a report was done. Governor Otto Kerner, who was, I think it was the governor of Indiana or Ohio, Governor Otto Kerner headed up the commission, okay? And they put together a report to deal with what's behind the rebellions. He was governor of Illinois, I should say. And they surveyed 23 cities. It was announced July 28, 1967, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. Okay, we have a few minutes before the break. And in responding to, so President Johnson charged the commission with answering 3 questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And what can be done to prevent racial disturbance in the future? What happened? Why did it happen? And what can be done to prevent racial disturbance in the future? In order to answer these questions, the commission surveyed 23 cities across the nation which experienced a racial rebellion. They found that racial disturbances were not the result of a single triggering event. It's just like today. It's just like today, because what caused these rebellions in 67 and 68, because that was not adequately addressed by the federal government, is not going to be adequately addressed by economic empowerment. Economic empowerment can play a part. But see, I'm all for economic empowerment. My degree's in business administration. I've taught entrepreneurship for years. Managed a business consulting company. I'm in documentaries dealing with economic empowerment. I'm in story. I deal with all that, but also understand politics. And politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. I've also been involved in writing public policy for the city of Detroit. The answer to bad public policies is not economic empowerment. That means you don't understand the problem. The answers to bad public policies is to fire the elected officials that wrote the bad public policies, put better people in place, and push policies and push policies and laws that are beneficial for you, and you can leverage your economics to enforce your politics. But the solution to bad public policy is not economic empowerment. If you think the solution to bad public policy is economic empowerment, that means you really don't understand either one of them. So, in order to answer these questions, the commission surveyed 23 cities across the nation which experienced a racial rebellion. They found that the racial disturbances were not the result of a single triggering event, but that in all cities surveyed, African Americans experienced severe economic and social disadvantages compared to whites. Also, the report noted that the riots were not the result of any conspiracy. Rather, they were a response to what the report identified as the racial attitudes and behaviors of white Americans toward African Americans. Let me repeat this. This is from the Kerner Commission report, which came out in 1968. It came out March of 1968. Okay, it was announced July 28, 1967, that the Kerner Commission, this panel, was going to be convened. Okay, and the report came out March of 1968, and the findings were correct, but President Lyndon Johnson disagreed with the findings and largely ignored the findings because he's also dealing with the Vietnam War at the same time. The report noted that the riots or rebellions, because these are rebellions, we were rebelling against white supremacy and racism, and we are still rebelling against white supremacy and racism. They were not the result of any conspiracy. Rather, they were a response to what the Kerner Commission report identified. Now, this is a report done basically by white people. They identified that the response was it was a response to racial attitudes and behaviors of white Americans towards African Americans. In responding to why the rebellions occurred, the Kerner report pointed to African Americans' frustration and feelings of powerlessness regarding extremely high rates of unemployment and underemployment. 40 million Americans unemployed as of this past Thursday. Probably about 6 million African Americans. Okay? Poverty, police brutality, and inadequate public services. The report we can add lack of health care on here because millions of people who are unemployed now, 40 million unemployed, millions of those have lost their health insurance. And at the very same time, Donald Trump, his Department of Justice, is in court trying to take away health care from at least 20 million people because they want to repeal and they want to abolish the entire Affordable Health Care Act. The U.S. Supreme Court is going to take up this case after the November election. That's going to take away health care from some poor white Republicans that voted for Trump. The report continued that a largely poor black population was confined in the central cities while a predominantly white population moved out. That's what we call white flight. And that the racism of white Americans was, quote, essentially responsible for the explosive mixture, end quote, leading to the uprisings. This is what the Kerner report said in March of 1968. You could, if you just read that right now and didn't talk about dates, you think this report came out today. So this is why when we understand policies and politics, we need to revisit what the Kerner Commission report stated and the remedies the Kerner Commission report stated. I'm all for reparations and all that. I'm telling you right now, that's a long shot. That ain't gonna happen tomorrow. That ain't gonna happen next year. That ain't gonna happen year after that. Okay, that's a long shot. That's long range strategy. Short range strategy, you can do. The Kerner Commission report is what white people said. And you look at what's taking place right now, that's something that can be pushed. Now, not under this jackass president. You got to get him out of office. Democrats have to take back control of the U.S. Senate, maintain control of the House of Representatives. I'm neither Democrat nor Republican, but I study policy and law and history. And I know who's blocking these bills that are in Congress right now that are beneficial to us. I know who's blocking them. Read this article from blackpast.org, blackpast.org. National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, 1967, Kerner Commission. Okay, we're coming up on a break here. On the other side of the break, we're going to continue with the updates dealing with what's going on, the fallout from the killing of George Floyd. We'll talk about where does the phrase "when the looting starts, the shooting starts" come from. That's a historic phrase from a segregationist that Donald Trump used. You listen to 910 AM Superstation, the Future Radio. I'm Michael Imhotep, the African History Network Show. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Brought to you by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
All right, stand by. One commercial break, everybody. Stand by. All right, how's everybody doing? Just bear with me. I got a ton of information here. Okay, just bear with me. I'm going to try to get through as much of this as I can. If you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show, paypal.me/the AHN show. Okay, how's everybody doing tonight? How you all like this type of information? Hopefully you're taking notes. Stand by. Okay, so we have a few advertisers here with the African History Network. A lot of people are looking for healthy products today, and Sage and Elm Apothecary.com can help you with that. They design over 60 different beautifully handcrafted soaps, natural toothpaste, hydrating oils, deodorants, face masks, shampoos, conditioners, and so much more. They use simple ingredients such as whole fruits, herbs, and vegetables. Each product crafted offers a unique plant-based experience. For more information, visit their website, sageandelmapothecary.com, APOTECARY, sageandelmapothecary.com, and use promo code AHNSPRING20, AHNSPRING20 to get 20% off your order. All right, so a lot of people are still practicing social distancing. A lot of people are still on quarantine in some degree. And summer is coming quickly and you want to get in shape. Well, SheRanHerselfFit.com, SheRanHerselfFit.com can help you with that. Now, She Ran Herself Fit is an apparel brand and can be purchased at the website SheRanHerselfFit.com. The owner of She Ran Herself Fit, her name is Felicia. Felicia lost over 200 pounds by changing her diet and running. Running may not be your motivation, it may not be your fitness activity, but you can find what is your fitness activity and get in shape. She Ran Herself Fit is a brand that promotes women living a healthy lifestyle. By making small sacrifices in your daily routine and changing your diet, you can combat many of the different diseases that are prevalent in the African American community, like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease. Visit their website, SheRanHerselfFit.com, SheRanHerselfFit.com, and let them know you found out about this from the African History Network. Okay, everybody stand by. Hey, if you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network. $, the AHN show through Cash App and paypal.me/the AHN show through PayPal. PayPal.me/the AHN show through PayPal. Okay, stand by. We're coming back from the break. Welcome back to the African History Network show right here on 910 AM, the Superstation, the Future Radio. Hey, I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep. It is Sunday, May 31st, 2020. And we are live. Hope everybody's doing well. Call-in number is 313-778-7600. 313-778-7600 is the call-in number. If you have a question or comment, 313-778-7600 is the call-in number. If you have a question or comment, try to keep your comments brief. And this is FCC regulated radio, so we can't have no crazy talk. I'm telling you right now. Okay, this ain't Blog Talk Radio. This is FCC regulated radio. Okay. All right. So right before the break, I was putting this in historical context, and we talked briefly about the 1967 Kerner Commission report, National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, which surveyed 23 cities to find out why the rebellions were taking place. Okay, read the article from blackpast.org, P-A-S-T, blackpast.org. They have about 6,000 pages of articles dealing with African American history and African history. National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. Okay, so check that out. All right. Let's go back to more updates. How's everybody doing on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network? We have Shannon and Latonya and Rosemary, just a few of the people watching. And on my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, I-M-H-O-T-E-P. We have Gemini and Lawrence, Mr. Tyrone, T. Lynn, W. Canty, Holly. JT, let me know if we have any callers, or let me know when we have any callers, okay? Thanks. Okay, let's go back to the updates on what's going on. And I know it's exhausting trying to keep up on everything, all these cities, all these protests going on, etc. So here are some significant developments in what's happened recently. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison will lead prosecutions related to George Floyd's death. Governor Tim Walz, W-A-L-Z, who's a Democrat, announced this on Sunday, May 31st. The governor, like Keith Ellison, a Democrat, acknowledged many people's distrust that authorities would bring justice for George Floyd, who died after a Minneapolis police officer knelt on his neck for almost 9 minutes. Okay, just a total lack of humanity. Just a total lack of humanity. The other thing that's interesting is that this is all taking place within the context of the 99th anniversary of the attack on Black Wall Street, North Tulsa and Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay, I posted a couple articles dealing with that today on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. I'm going to try to squeeze that in at the end of the show, dealing with Black Wall Street. Okay, I've done a 2.5-hour lecture dealing with the history of Black Wall Street that's available at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, if you want to get that. But it's interesting that all of this is taking place within this context of the 99th anniversary of May 31st, and then going into June 1st in North Tulsa, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay, so at least 5 people were killed in violence that flared as demonstrations in parts of the country devolved into mayhem. Gunfire rang out from Detroit to Indianapolis to Omaha, Nebraska, where authorities said people were slain in shootings connected to the protests. Police arrested at least 2,564 people in 24 U.S. cities over the weekend, according to a tally from the Washington Post. Nearly a fifth of those arrests were in Los Angeles. Charges included violating curfew, but also burglary and damaging property. On Sunday night, protests and arrests could escalate as cities increasingly enforce curfews and set them earlier. Now, JT, I sent you the clip of Dr. King talking about a riot is the language of the unheard. Cue that up at about the 1 minute mark for me, because I'm going to go to that clip here in just a minute. Oh, you don't have internet right now. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Okay. Okay, hopefully about 15 minutes internet will be back up at the radio station. Okay. All right. I'm trying to see if I can play it. I can play it from my I was trying to see if I can play it from my end, but okay. All right, Arizona is enacting a statewide curfew at the request of local leaders. Governor Doug Ducey, a Republican, announced Sunday as dozens of major cities try similar measures to maintain order and protests that have erupted into chaos at night. Thousands of National Guard troops have been activated in 26 states and the District of Columbia. We know in the state of Minnesota, for Saturday going into Saturday night, the governor activated 13,000 National Guard troops. That's the first time they've activated all the National Guard troops since, I think they said, either World War I or World War II. On Sunday night, protests and arrests could escalate as cities increasingly enforce. Okay, I've said it. A driver who barreled his tanker truck toward protesters filling Minneapolis I-35 highway has been arrested. Police said the trucker sent crowds running, but police said did not appear to hit any of the thousands who had gathered. We also saw that 2 HBCU students were maced by police in Atlanta, and they were fired. I posted an article dealing with this. It's all types of craziness taking place. Okay, now it's not. I'm not saying it's every city, and I'm not saying every protest. There's craziness taking place in every protest. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, but I am saying we keep seeing these incidences like right now taking place this weekend. Okay, so this is crazy. 2 police officers fired after HBCU student shocked, dragged from car amid protests. All right, so read the articles that I post on my Facebook fan page, the African History Network. I can't get through all this information here, but I'm at least going to try to give you the names of some of these articles so you can research this and read these yourself. This is from HuffingtonPost.com. 2 police officers fired after HBCU students shocked, dragged from car amid protests. 2 young black people were violently arrested in Atlanta as demonstrations sparked by George Floyd's death unfolded nationwide. Atlanta moved quickly Sunday to immediately fire 2 police officers involved in the violent arrest of 2 young African Americans who were roughly dragged from a car and apparently shocked with stun guns as anti-racism protests erupted across the nation. The ugly confrontation was captured live on video by CBS Channel 46 Saturday as a group of officers suddenly stormed a car with the 2 college students inside. City and police officials spent the day studying the body cams of the officers involved after Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, who would make a fantastic vice president, I'm just saying, okay, I'm just saying, after she said she saw the disturbing video, she announced at an evening press briefing that 2 officers would be fired immediately and 3 officers would be assigned to desk duty pending further investigation. She said, quote, "There clearly was an excessive use of force. We understand that our officers are working very long hours under an enormous amount of stress, but we also understand that the use of excessive force is never acceptable," end quote. Read the rest of this article here. That's good. They need to be fired. I don't know if they're going to be prosecuted, but they definitely needed to be fired. Okay. All right, let's continue here. So we'll post that link here. That's from Huffington Post. Let's go back to these updates. Now, attorney Benjamin Crump, who is representing George Floyd's family, on Sunday denounced the violent actions of some protesters, but he said on CBS News, Face the Nation, quote, "Many elected officials have to understand that is not these protesters that are starting these fires across America. It is police brutality and a racist criminal justice system. And the only thing that can put out these fires are police accountability and equal justice." Okay, that's partly true, but you got another force coming in, starting a lot of these fires and doing a lot of this vandalism, and it don't have nothing to do with the protests. They're using the protests as a cover. Anarchist groups, white supremacist groups, things like this. That's another force interjecting themselves into this. That's why we have to be careful when we attend these protests. That's why, if I go to a protest, I need to know who the hell is organizing this protest. I know people who organize protests here in Detroit. I need to know. When there's people coming from outside, I'm not talking about the NAACP, National Chapter, National Action Network, things like that, coming in, organizing protests. I'm talking about people you ain't never heard before, gonna come in Detroit and organize us to do what? I'm like, oh, look here, man, come on. you got to run out of somebody else. All right. Now, sometimes they have good intentions. Okay, I'm not saying somebody that doesn't live in Detroit, doesn't live in the state of Michigan, that can't come in with good intentions and be, totally transparent. I'm not saying that, but some other one, especially with this right here. So Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison is going to lead prosecutions related to George Floyd's death. Washington Post has an article about this, as well as NBC News. That was announced by the governor late today. Keith Ellison is African American, former representative from the state of Minnesota. Excellent, very competent. I saw interviews he did on MSNBC dealing with this. So it's taken out of the hands of the local prosecutor, and Keith Ellison is going to prosecute this case. His office is going to prosecute this case. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison Democrat will take the lead on prosecutions related to George Floyd's death, Governor Tim Walz announced Sunday, saying the change will help ensure justice in the high-profile case. Ellison said he will be working with the original prosecutor, Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman. Freeman had said earlier that, quote, recent developments in the facts of the case, end quote, meant Ellison's help would be valuable. Governor Walz acknowledged Sunday many people's distrust that authorities would bring justice for George Floyd, who died after a Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, knelt on his neck for about 8 minutes. And we know George Floyd repeatedly said, "I cannot breathe," before going limp as bystanders protested. Just total lack of humanity. Okay, just like with Eric Garner. Okay, now one of the things that at least was good that happened here is that the day after this took place, the 4 officers were fired. Because when you look at Eric Garner, Officer Daniel Pantaleo, it took 5 years for him to be fired. And he was not prosecuted. The grand jury found that there was no grounds to prosecute. Okay? Because it was basically white people on the grand jury, and they said, oh, you know, he didn't mean it. He's just trying to protect us from those people. You know, this is what happened. So this is why I know there are a lot of people. When I heard the charges of third-degree murder, I have been doing radio for 10 years. I've covered dozens of police shootings, things like this. Read police reports, read transcripts of trials, etc. I don't get caught up on the charges and it should have been first degree, why is it third degree? The reason why, and before it was announced that he was going to be handling the prosecution, Attorney General Keith Ellison of the state of Minnesota talked about how hard it is to prosecute and get a conviction on police officers, especially if you got a predominantly white jury. Even if you have videotape, so what? After, I'm telling you, it's extremely hard. When you deal with first degree murder, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 jurors that they intended to kill him. Now, you and I may believe that they intended to kill him, but you have to prove it based upon the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 jurors. It's a good chance you're talking about Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Minneapolis is 63% white. It's a good chance the majority of the people on the jury are not going to be black. So third degree murder, the burden of proof is easier to prove. The goal is get a conviction, because I'm telling you right now, Paul Butler, and I got a clip from Paul Butler, I don't know if we'll be able to play it. Paul Butler has been interviewed a number of times on MSNBC, former federal prosecutor, and he's a law professor at Georgetown University. And Paul Butler is correct. He said third degree murder, based upon what we're dealing with, third degree murder would be the correct charge. It's too hard to prove first degree murder. He said this is a case that the prosecution has to win. This is a case that the prosecution has to win. Because if the prosecution loses, then that basically means that police officers, especially white police officers, can just kill African-American men, African-Americans in general, especially African-American men, in front of witnesses like that with impunity. Okay? So this is a case that the prosecution has to win. So based upon the evidence that we're looking at now, third degree murder is the correct call, not first degree. Now the family wants first degree murder charges and things like that. That increases the chance of the officer being acquitted. because he may testify, he'll break down and cry. He'll say he wasn't trying to kill him. He was scared. He feared for his life. They were just trying to subdue him, and he kept squirming and things like this, and he didn't mean to kill him. This is what's gonna happen. And then what they're gonna do, they're gonna bring out pictures of him with puppies and little kids, and he gave a little black kid a lollipop 15 years ago, and the kid went on to college, and they're gonna do all this, and they're gonna try to smear George Floyd. This is what's gonna happen. So, okay, all right, I'm telling you, and one of my frat brothers, Warren Ballantyne, who's an attorney, he does radio in Chicago. We used to be on the Empowerment Radio Network together doing nationally syndicated radio. He posted on his Facebook fan page, he said, first-degree murder is not the right charge. He said third-degree murder is the correct charge. Okay? Third-degree murder. He said you ain't going to be able to prove first-degree murder. All right, let's continue. Okay, so Attorney General Keith Ellison is leading this case. Ellison said he will be working with the original prosecutor, Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman. Governor Walz acknowledged Sunday many people distrust that authorities would bring justice for Floyd, who died after. Okay. Officer Derek Chauvin, who was fired, has been charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. Authorities have yet to announce charges for 3 other Minneapolis officers who were also fired after Floyd's death, but Freeman has said more charges may come. Okay, read that article there. Let me see. I'm just trying to get to some highlights. I've read so much stuff. Okay, so we have protests all across the country. Okay, yeah, we're up on the break. Okay. All right, look, hey, guys, we're up on a break. You listen to the African History Network show right here on 910 AM Superstation Future Radio. I'm Michael Imhotep. We'll be back in a few minutes. All right, welcome back to the African History Network show right here on 910 AM Superstation Future Radio. I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep. It is Sunday, May 31st, 2020. We're live. Calling numbers 313-778-7600, 313-778-7600. It's the call-in number if you have a question or comment. During the break, I was talking to people on my Facebook fan page, the African History Network. Somebody asked what's taking so long for the other officers to be charged. I think with Attorney General Keith Ellison on the case, they'll be charged very quickly. But at the same time, I can't stress this enough. I've been doing radio 10 years. I've covered dozens of police shootings. I've read police reports. I've read transcripts of cases dealing with police. I focus on the conviction. That's what I focus on. All this other stuff, how long it takes to charge the police, and they're out on bail, the bail wasn't high enough. What I focus on is the conviction. All that other stuff, I'm serious. I really don't worry about that, because I've seen cases just like Officer Yanez with Philando Castile. We thought he was going to be convicted. Officer Yanez was going to be convicted. No, he wasn't. Eric Garner case is on video. Okay? Officer Daniel Pantaleo killed Eric Garner, choked him. That's what led to him. Eric Garner was, even though he had pre-existing conditions, people could argue that white supremacy and stupidity is a pre-existing condition. But we do know Eric Garner was walking and talking before he was choked. Okay? And when it went to the grand jury and that area, that city or whatever it was, where they pulled the grand jury from, you had a lot of retired police officers there. It was a largely white community. They saw the video and they said, oh, it's terrible that he died, but the officer didn't do anything wrong. So I focus on the conviction. All the same thing with Amber Geiger. All right, what's taking so long for being arrested? Look, I don't give a damn about none of this stuff. I'm serious, I don't, because I've seen cases where we thought the officer was going to be convicted and he wasn't. So that's what I focus on. Whether it take 5 days to be charged, 10 days, whether they get out on bond, all this stuff. Prosecute this case properly and put their asses in prison. Period. That's what I focus on. All right, let's continue. Okay, I want to go to this. NBCnews.com had a good article. Donald Trump once again made a stupid remark. You remember last week we talked about Biden and his stupid remark, if you ain't black. Now, okay, now let's keep it 100. Based upon what's happened in the past week, if you look at Trump's record and you look at Biden's record and your ass still confused, you probably ain't black, you're probably white. Let me repeat that again. This ain't a, you ain't black if you don't vote for him. No. Listen to what I just said. If you look at Trump's record and you look at Biden's record, if you look at Trump's policies, you look at Biden's policies, and each week we're going through breaking down Biden's agenda for Black America. We already went through and broke down Biden's policies. I did that April 26th and March 10th. Go back and watch those broadcasts. 2020. If you look at Trump's record, you look at Biden's record, you look at Trump's policies, you look at Biden's policies. If you still confused between the two, not confused about whether you want Biden, trust Biden, and all that stuff, not that. If you confused between the two who to vote for, you probably ain't black, you probably white. I don't think you just understand what I said. Some white people were like, oh no, we don't want Trump, we gonna vote for Biden. Other white people are like, I ain't really sure. I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, you're not black. I'm not saying if you're black, that means you vote for Biden. No, that's not what I'm saying. Listen to what I'm saying. Okay? Y'all understand what I'm saying? On Facebook? Did you see, if you don't understand what if you don't understand what I just said, you don't understand this. If you do not understand European white supremacy and racism, what it is and how it works, everything else that you think that you understand will totally confuse you. See, how many of y'all understand what I'm saying? Cynthia understands it. Erica, yeah, y'all understand what I'm saying, right? Go back and listen to the broadcast from last Sunday where I broke down what Charlemagne said. Charlemagne said it's not about, for many African Americans, he said it's not about whether they vote for Biden or Trump. It's about whether they vote for Biden or don't vote at all. What I just told you, because you're not listening, you got to listen with your third eye. I said, if you look at Trump's record and you look at Biden's record, if you look at Trump's policies and you look at Biden's policies, and between the two of them, you still confused on who to vote for? Yeah, it's probably because you ain't black. No, you're white. You may be white. You could be Hispanic who thinks white. Okay, I'm not trying to polarize people. I'm just explaining this to you. Okay? All right. All right. So Zandrine and Latanya, Melvin, so people understand what I'm saying now, right? I didn't get a chance. We had a long show last week. I didn't get a chance to put that in there, but that's something that I'm thinking. And this week right here, more people realize. See, I told people in 2016, if you got a police killing of an African American and you got protests in the streets, you don't want Trump as president. Trump is law and order. Trump would talk when in 2016 when he was running for president. Trump said they need to have stop and frisk in Chicago, and if he could, he'd have stop and frisk all across the country in African American communities. He said they need stop and frisk in Chicago after stop and frisk was deemed unconstitutional by a federal judge. But he don't care, because this is how he thinks of African Americans. He talked about Minnesota, and he said they have to get harder and they need more force and things like this. He didn't talk about resources in Minnesota to help the African American community. He didn't talk about we need to find out what the root cause is this. We need to understand how racism and white supremacy and inequities in healthcare and education lead to this explosion. He talked about any of that. It's just when he the way Trump thinks. Trump is a throwback to Richard Nixon. Okay, let me just. I'm going to get into this article from NBCNews.com. This deals with history. Let me just give you some background history. This is what I explained to people in 2016. I warned people about. And I did a 2.5-hour lecture in early 2017 called African American Resistance in the Era of Donald Trump, Voter Suppression, Reparations, and How Elections Have Consequences. In 2016, Donald Trump ran on the platform of law and order. It wasn't just immigration, okay, and demonizing Mexicans and things like this, right? It wasn't just immigration and the fear of the browning of America, okay? He ran on the platform of law and order. Law and order is the platform that Richard Nixon ran on in 1968 when Richard Nixon became president. Nixon was the president after Lyndon Johnson. 1967, there were 159 violent uprisings in this country. As I said before, Detroit, Newark, New Jersey, things like this. All of them were not on the level of a Detroit. But you had this taking place. 1968, Dr. King's assassinated. April 4th, 1968. You have rebellions in 125 cities. Richard Nixon runs in 68 on the platform of law and order. Law and order means protect white people and lock up African Americans. Richard Nixon ran as a backlash to the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, affirmative action, any perceived gains that African Americans got. He was a backlash to all of this. Then, June 17th, 1971, Richard Nixon launches his war on drugs. The war on drugs didn't start with the 94 crime bill. That starts with Richard Nixon, who declared his war on drugs in front of the U.S. Congress June 17th, 1971, because he was asking for an increase in funding. This is what starts the increase in the prison population, because the U.S. prison population quadruples from 1970 to 1993. If you go to bjs.gov, Bureau of Justice Statistics, bjs.gov, and you look at the U.S. prison populations from 1970 to 1993, you'll see what I'm talking about. This goes back to Richard Nixon. So, Roger Ailes was an advisor to Richard Nixon. Roger Ailes was good friends of Donald Trump. Roger Ailes founded the Fox News Network. Roger Ailes founded the Fox News Network because he felt that if Richard Nixon had a news network, a television network, that was on his side, then he would not have been impeached because of the Watergate hearing, because of the Watergate scandal. He felt that if Nixon had have had a news network that was on his side, Nixon would not have been impeached. That news network is Fox News, and Fox News saved Donald Trump from being removed from office. Roger Ailes was good friends with Donald John Trump. Donald Trump has another slimy friend. Now, Roger Ailes passed away. Good. Well, I shouldn't say good. Goodbye. Maybe I should say that. That's more politically correct. Say goodbye, Roger. Donald Trump has another slimy friend named, what's the other? I forgot. Hold on. I forgot. It comes to, but this other one was indicted, found guilty, and he was friends with, he was an early advisor to Donald Trump, but he was friends with Richard Nixon. Okay, and he has a tattoo of Richard Nixon between his shoulder blades. How many cuts? It's like, what does Trump find these people? Okay, Roger Stone, that's his name, Roger Stone. Okay, Roger Stone. Right? So, Trump's campaign in 2016 was a throwback to Richard Nixon. Then also, there were people who were familiar with George Wallace. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, 1963, and there's the famous footage of him saying, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, right? A lot of people who were alive back at that time, they hear Donald Trump, they say Donald Trump reminds them of Governor George Wallace. I mean, Governor George Wallace ran for president also unsuccessfully. So this is why you have to understand history. If we understood Richard Nixon, we would have seen Donald Trump coming and we would have stopped him. This is what I was screaming in 2016. And people thought this was a game. Now we're dealing with the Hunger Games. If you don't think we're dealing with the Hunger Games, have you seen go talk to people who work at food banks and ask them, are we dealing with the Hunger Games? Where does the phrase "when the looting starts, the shooting starts" come from? NBCnews.com, and then also Washington Post had a good article dealing with this also. This was a phrase that Trump used. Instead of being a healer in chief, he's a divider in chief and an instigator, habitual line stepper. Before Trump, it was uttered by a Southern police chief during civil rights unrest in the 1960s. So Donald Trump tweeted, let's see, hold on. Donald Trump tweeted, "These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty and we will assume control. But when the looting starts, the shooting starts." Thank you. Now, Twitter marked the tweet, and it said this tweet violated the Twitter rules about glorifying violence. However, Twitter has determined that it may be in the public's interest for the tweet to remain accessible. So they put that note there. Okay, and Trump is going crazy because Twitter, Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, is finally stepping up and checking Trump. Okay, and putting these tags on his tweets, either saying that they fact checking the tweets because he lies so much, over 18,000 lies and false misleading statements. All right. Twitter said early Friday that a post by Donald Trump about the protests overnight in Minneapolis glorified violence because of the historical context of his last line, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." The phrase was used by both Miami's police chief Walter Headley in 1967 and by presidential candidate and segregationist George Wallace the following year. Now, with George Wallace, he used a line similar to that. NBC News needs to update this. Snopes.com has a good article dealing with this that goes deeper into it. Okay, George Wallace didn't use those exact words. I'm going to pull up this article from Snopes.com. Now, Miami's police chief Walter Headley used it when he addressed his department's, quote, crackdown on slum hoodlums, end quote, according to a United Press International article from the time, that time. Miami Police Chief Walter Headley, who was chief of police in Miami for 20 years, said that law enforcement was going after, quote, young hoodlums from 15 to 21 who have taken advantage of the civil rights campaign. "We don't mind being accused of police brutality," end quote, he said. Now, when you go, JT, is the internet up? Can we play any clips? The article, let me know, JT. The article goes on to say, quote, "There is only one way to handle looters and arsonists during a riot, and that is to shoot them on sight. I've let the word filter down. When the looting starts, the shooting starts," end quote. This is from Miami Police Chief Walter Headley in 1967. Okay, and this was reported in the New York Times in 1970. This is what he said. Okay, so anybody just tuning in. I'm not advocating violence. This is a direct historical quote. This is what I'm talking about. All right. This is who Donald Trump quoted on Friday. Now, Friday afternoon, Trump tried to defend his remarks, tweeting, quote, "Looting leads to shooting, and that's why a man was shot and killed in Minneapolis on Wednesday night." okay? Or look at what just happened in Louisville with 7 people shot. I don't want this to happen, and that's what the expression "put out last night" means. Donald Trump went on to say it was spoken as fact, not as a statement. It's very simple. Nobody should have any problem with this other than the haters and those looking to cause trouble on social media. Honor the memory of George Floyd. Now, if you want to talk about honoring the memory of George Floyd, George Floyd's brother was interviewed by Reverend Al Sharpton on Politics Nation after Joe Biden had a 30-minute conversation with the family, a real heart-to-heart 30-minute conversation with the family. Donald Trump talked to George Floyd's brother for a few minutes. George Floyd told Reverend Al Sharpton that Trump basically didn't let him speak. And Trump basically talked the whole time and didn't really want to hear what he had to say. Now, the phrase "when the looting starts, the shooting starts" was considered to have contributed to the city's race riots in the late 1960s, according to the Washington Post, the city of Miami. And let's pull up this article here. Now, Walter Headley, who died only a few months later, and let's go back, hold on. We'll go back to that article. Then also, when we look at the one from Snopes.com, did Trump and George Wallace both say when the looting starts, the shooting starts? Okay. JT, let me know. Is the internet up? Let me know. The president's use of the infamous quote in May 2020 raised questions about its origins. So they talk about George Wallace in here. What's false is that former Alabama Governor George Wallace made a similar statement in regards to looters, saying, "Shoot them dead on the spot," quote unquote. That may not prevent the burning and looting, but it sure will stop it after it starts, he said. However, we found no record of George Wallace saying when the looting starts, the shooting starts. A Miami police chief, however, did use the latter phrase in 1968. Okay, that's Snopes.com doing a fact check on this. So check that out, and we'll post this link here also. Let's go back to this article because this ties into history. And this is why it's important to have somebody competent as president, somebody who has judgment, good judgment, somebody who can empathize with people. But then also we have to have policies put in place and that address these issues. And see, what's very interesting is that on AM Joanne Reed, and I was trying to find the clip, maybe we'll have it for next Sunday. Joanne Reed played this clip from October 2019, I think it was. It was at a rally. Donald Trump did at a rally. And it was a police officer, either from a police union or something like that, who talked about how under the Obama administration, the police were handcuffed. And Trump has taken the handcuffs off of police. And the police have more freedom to do what they want to do. When Trump ran for president, Trump talked about how he said police need to have more power, not less power. He and Mike Pence were against holding police officers accountable. They were against having investigations into the patterns and practices of police departments. This is what the Obama administration was doing. Now, it is true the majority of regulated police is at the state level because you have 50 individual state governments. And states have a lot of power because of the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But there were things that the Obama administration was putting in place and using. The Trump administration has reversed these. For instance, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a big issue around police having military grade equipment. Well, the Obama administration put in place a policy not to send military grade equipment to police. Trump reversed that. Under the Obama administration, you had 24, 25 investigations into the patterns and practices of police departments. Attorney General Eric Holder was interviewed on MSNBC in the past couple of days talking about this. Attorney General Loretta Lynch was interviewed as well. That entered 14 or 15 police departments into consent decrees that are enforced by a federal judge. And this is studying the patterns and practices in police departments. This Minnesota Police Department, they need an investigation into patterns and practices. But starting with Jeff Sessions, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, Trump's first Attorney General, he said they were going to back off police, basically take a hands-off approach to police, and they stopped these investigations to hold police departments accountable. This is an example of how elections have consequences. And then you see the Civil Rights Department at the Department of Justice that's been gutted. All this deals with policies. All this deals with politics. And understanding whose policies are most beneficial to African Americans. Whose policies who will cause the least amount of harm. Who can create an environment for us to push our agenda the farthest and get the most accomplished, and get the most policies put in place, the most laws put in place, the most enforced, etc. In understanding federal government and how federal government impacts policing, how federal government impacts state government, city, etc. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. All that's been reversed under Trump. So when I hear people say, well, we're not going to vote, we're just going to do economic empowerment and invest in the stock market. I mean, that's good, that's needed. But what the hell does that have to do with laws and policies and policing? I mean, this sounds good in documentaries and stuff like that. And I'm in 7 documentaries. I know the game. But there's been a culture shift from the Trump administration from the Obama administration to the culture administration when it comes to policing. On Saturday, Attorney General William Barr did this weird press conference where he talked about protesters attending these protests who have another agenda, and he calls out Antifa. But he doesn't call out white supremacist organizations, and you have officials in these cities saying they're white supremacist organizations who are at these protests instigating. They're on social media talking. Joanne Reed talked about this on MSNBC. They're on social media talking about going to these protests and getting their loot on and causing destruction, things like this. Trump and Attorney General William Barr are now calling out the white supremacist organizations that are involved in this. They're only calling out one organization. So you have to understand what's behind all this. Why aren't you calling out the white supremacist organizations? Is it because they voted for you? Is that why? All right, let's continue. We only have a few minutes left here. No, that wasn't the police immunity bill, Eddie. If you're referring to Blue Lives Matter, that was under Trump. Please use Google. It helps to do research, especially before you post on this page. Let's see here. And when you go back and study all this, you have police unions blaming Black Lives Matter and the Obama administration, and specifically President Obama, for the war on police. Go back and read those articles, because I read them. Okay? And then Trump ran on the platform of law and order and taking a hands-off approach to police. You go back to June 2017. Donald Trump was speaking to police, and he told them, when you put somebody, a suspect, in the car, after you handcuff them, And you know how you say, watch your head. It's all right. You don't have to watch your head. You don't have to put their hand up. Your hand up there to protect the head. It's okay. All right. So if you want to post on this page, it helps your argument if you actually know what the hell you're talking about. I'm just warning you right now. All right. Let's continue here. I'm somebody that actually does research. If you haven't figured it out by now. Okay. All right, so let's go back to this. When the looting starts, the shooting starts. Okay. So Walter Headley, who died only a few months later in 1968 and had been denounced by civil rights leader, was described in the Associated Press obituary as the, quote, architect of a crime crackdown that sent police dogs and shotgun-toting patrolmen into Miami's slums in force, end quote. This was Walter Headley. This is who Donald Trump quoted. Now, George Wallace, who was a Southern segregationist Democrat who fought to preserve segregation during his political career, also used the phrase when he ran a third-party presidential campaign in 1968. According to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, he said that the same thing. He said the same thing to his supporters during a campaign event in Pittsburgh Civic Arena. I'm not quite sure about that. They cite that when the shooting starts as George Wallace. I'm not quite sure about that because Snopes said that he said George Wallace said something similar, but not the exact thing. But if Donald Trump is quoting George Wallace, oh my God. I'm not talking about the George Wallace that's the king of the mama jokes who's on the Tom Jones Morning Show. I ain't talking about that George Wallace. Okay, I'm talking about the notorious George Wallace, who was the segregationist governor of Alabama. Because I know somebody here, George Wallace, and they think of the comedian, African American comedian George Wallace. No, that's not who I'm talking about. Okay. Then read the article from the Washington Post. They have a really good one also. I'm going to try to squeeze all this information here the last few minutes, and we're going to continue this discussion on my social media platforms, the African History Network on Facebook, and my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP, and listen to audio podcasts of all these broadcasts at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. So if you miss our show, we have audio podcasts. We're on 8 different podcast platforms where we get your podcasts from. We're on Stitcher, iTunes, Castbox, FM Player, TuneIn, and some others. Twitter flags Trump, White House for glorifying violence after tweeting Minneapolis looting will lead to shooting. That's from Washington Post. Read that article also. Okay. Let's okay, so let me do this here in the remaining minutes we have left on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation. Let me try to break down some history, and I had this show laid out, but we did a 20-minute interview at the top of the show with Michigan Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist, which I'm thankful for, but it kind of threw off the show. So I hear a lot of talk about white supremacy and racism. And when we deal with the shooting of George Floyd and the anger that's taking place. Back in about 2018, there was the day that Roseanne Barr was fired from the reboot of the TV show Roseanne because of tweets that she made. We know she's a Donald Trump supporter. There was a special that night, 8 p.m. on MSNBC, co-hosted by Joy-Ann Reid and Chris Hayes. It was called Everyday Racism in America. And it was already scheduled to take place, and they incorporated what took place with Roseanne Barr into it. They spent an hour talking about everyday racism in America, and they never defined from a historical perspective what racism is. Let me help you out. We have to understand racism from a historical perspective. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism has nothing to do with not liking people, calling people racial epithets, calling people the N-word or anything like that. Racism comes out of the ideology of white supremacy. So you have to understand history here. I'm going to try to make this as succinctly as possible. White supremacy is the ideology that Europeans, white people, are superior, their culture is superior, etc., and they can subordinate people. Okay, it's the ideology. This evolves as Europeans are coming out of the Dark Ages. You have to understand history to understand this. Okay, in the late 1400s, going into the early 1500s, Europeans are coming out of the Dark Ages. They had lost 1/4 to 1/3 of their population to the Black Death, the bubonic plague. They lost 25 million to 75 million people. They had been fighting against the African Moors for hundreds of years. The Moors go into Europe, into the Iberian Peninsula, today known as Spain and Portugal, in 711 AD. These Africans go all throughout Europe. They go into Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, Austria, Germany. They go all across Europe. They intermix into the European population. Now they save Europe, bring Europe out of the Dark Ages, take the teachings from ancient Africa, especially ancient Kemet and the Nile Valley region of Africa, into Europe. They bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. They intermix with the European population and change the complexion of Europeans to varying degrees. This is why historically the Spanish and Portuguese were darker than the Austrians, the Germans, and the English, because Spain and Portugal is closer to Morocco, where the Moors were going into Europe. And also when we look at Sicilians were darker. Okay? As Europeans start to circumnavigate the globe, going into the late 1400s, then going into the 1500s, they see that the majority of the world is non-white. And as they intermix with those people, they see that those offspring, those children, are not white anymore. And they realize, because they had been dealing with the Moors for hundreds of years and they saw what happened. This is because you had a lot of mixed race people in Europe. This is how you get Queen Charlotte Sophia, who was the wife of King George III. King George III was the king who the 13 colonies are rebelling against with the American Revolution. Okay? How much time we have left, JT?
We are actually out of time.
We're actually out of time. All right, so we'll continue. We'll continue this on our social media platforms. And thanks for tuning in to the African History Network show right here on 910 AM Superstation Future Radio. It's not over till we win Wakanda Forever. Stay tuned for Pastor Mo. We'll talk to you next week. Okay, stay tuned on social media. Okay, all right. Okay, so we do 2 hours on 910 AM Superstation, Sundays 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I do radio here in Detroit. I'm a radio personality, radio talk show host. I've been doing radio here in Detroit 4 years on 910 AM Superstation every Sunday, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. All right, so let's continue here. So, and it's important to read. It's important to read the ISIS papers by Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, and it's important to read Golden Age of the Moor, edited by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Okay, because this book right here is like the preeminent book dealing with the history of the Moors in Europe during medieval time. So, and I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version here for the sake of time. Okay. Then also another book to read is this one here by Runoko Rashidi, Black Star: The African Presence in Early Europe. Because if we understand the history of the Moors in Europe and what happened, then all this stuff will fall into place. This is Europeans trying to preserve genetic white survival. That's what this is about. That's what racism is about. Okay, so when we deal with white supremacy, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing said that white supremacy and racism, she looked at them as the same thing. As a historian, understanding this, and she understood it, but as a historian, I look at them as being two different things. But white supremacy is the ideology and this comes out of Europeans coming out of the Dark Ages. But racism is the power structure that's put in place to uphold and enforce white supremacy. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism occurs when one race of people control the majority of the wealth, power, resources, privileges, benefits, land, access to education, access to opportunity, health care, jobs, media, etc. And they use that to marginalize, subordinate, and do harm to another race of people. That's the power structure that's put in place. White supremacy is the ideology. The power structure of racism upholds and enforces the ideology of white supremacy. They work together, but they're not the same thing. They work together, but from my analysis of this, they are not the same thing. So we see that Queen Charlotte Sophia was of African descent, African Moorish ancestry on her mother's side. I've talked about this before. And when you look throughout Europe, you're going to see, because of the Moors intermixing with these Europeans, you're going to see a lot of what we would call mixed race people. So as Europeans are setting up these various colonies and they're going into other people's lands, conquering their lands, we deal with Columbus, we deal with others, right? They're putting together this system of racism, trying to preserve genetic white survival, because they understand what happens. They understand that they can become genetically wiped off the face of the earth if they keep intermixing with these people. The race of people that have the highest concentration of melanin receive the brunt of racism. The race of people that have the highest concentration of melanin receive the brunt of racism, the most directed towards them, the most hostility towards them. It's African men in general, specifically in this case African American men, who receive the brunt of racism, because because it's the man who imposes sex. This all deals with sex. This deals with sex and preserving genetic white survival. If you don't believe me, go study the history of lynchings in this country and see what the majority of lynchings in this country had to do with sex. The black man was accused of raping white women, having an affair with a white woman, dreaming about a white woman, looking at a white woman, walking too closely behind a white woman. That's what all this is about. But it's coming from a need to preserve genetic white survival. When we go back, Dr. Claude Anderson talks about in Black Labor White Wealth, I think also a little bit of Paranomics, he talks about the doctrine of exclusion in 1638 in the colony of Maryland. Because in the British colonies, they're setting up this system. This system does not already exist in what we call the 13 colonies, right? We operate. I've dealt with this before, especially when the 1619 Project came out and some other presentations. We operate based upon this misconception that the Africans on the White Line slave ship, pirate ship, slave ship, August 20th, 1619 in Virginia, when they're exchanged for food and supplies and water, we operate based upon this misconception that they just walk out into this a already constructed system, fully operated system of racism and slavery in this country. And that's not the case. It's forming. Codified slave laws didn't even exist in the British colonies in 1619. If you read Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., you've heard me talk about this before, read chapter 2. He lays this out in chapter 2. Codified slave laws didn't even exist in any of the 13 colonies in 1619. The first colony to have codified slave laws was Massachusetts in 1641. They don't come to Virginia till about 1661. So that first group of Africans, they're put into a form of indentured servitude for about 3 to 5 years, and then basically largely released after that. The whole way this history evolves is different than the way we think it evolves. But most African Americans don't understand history. Most white people don't understand history. This is why this study from the Southern Poverty Law Center is so important. I know I'm going fast. I'm trying to cram all this into a very short period of time, just to give you a historical foundation. Okay. Teaching Hard History, American Slavery. Teaching Hard History, American Slavery. This is about a 52 or 56 page study from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And you can download this. Go to splcenter.org, splcenter.org. This documents how the history of slavery is largely mistaught in our schools, misunderstood, etc., and the ramifications of this. Okay? This ties into when people graduate from high school, graduate from college, don't understand the history of this country, don't understand the history of slavery, don't understand the history of African Americans, and then they become president, they become senators, they become police officers, judges, etc. But in this study, they did a survey of 1,000 high school seniors to test them on what they knew about slavery. Only 8% of high school seniors surveyed could identify slavery as a central reason why the Civil War was fought. Only 8%, not 80, only 8% of high school seniors, 12th graders, many of them will be freshmen the following year, only 8% of high school seniors surveyed could identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. So if you really don't understand why the Civil War was fought, right? You really don't understand all this history. And then the fight over Confederate monuments and all this stuff. 2/3, or 68%, did not know that it took a constitutional amendment to formally end slavery. It wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. No, it was the 13th Amendment, ratified December 6, 1865, adopted December 18th, 1865. They had to amend the U.S. Constitution because the U.S. Constitution sanctioned slavery. Even though Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution laid the foundation for the international transatlantic slave trade to be abolished through an act of Congress March 2nd, 1807, and that went into effect January 1st, 1808. That is true. But then Article 4, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution laid the foundation for the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 and the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 we see talked about in the film Harriet. So if they're in 12th grade and don't understand this history, then see, the education system in this country has to change. The history of African Americans has to be taught in every school across the country. The real history of slavery has to be taught in every school across this country. Fewer than 1 in 4 students, or 22%, can correctly identify how provisions in the U.S. Constitution gave advantage to slaveholders, like the 3/5 Compromise of 1787, which influences the Electoral College at the time, influenced the Electoral College. Teachers are serious about teaching slavery, but there's a lack of deep coverage of the subject in the classroom. Although teachers overwhelmingly, or 90%, claim they feel comfortable discussing slavery in their classrooms, their responses to open-ended questions reveal profound unease around the topic. 58% of teachers, so they surveyed 1,700 social studies teachers also in the survey. 58% of teachers find their textbooks inadequate. Popular textbooks fail to provide comprehensive coverage of slavery and enslaved peoples. The best textbook, singular, achieved a score of 70% against our rubric of what should be included in the study of American slavery. The average score was 46%. Go to splcenter.org, splcenter.org, which is Southern Poverty Law Center, and just search for Teaching Hard History, American Slavery. Teaching Hard History, American Slavery. Okay? And you can read this full study. I've read it. Took it to a printer, got it printed up. And I teach from this. This is deep. 40% of teachers believe their state offers insufficient support for teaching about slavery. They lay out all types. They lay out how the history of slavery is being taught incorrectly in our schools. You can also use this for homeschooling. Okay? Then they lay out all these recommendations to more properly teach the history of slavery. One of the things they tell you in here not to do is don't do slave reenactments. Don't do slave reenactments. They tell you this in here. I just heard a story recently about, and they talk about all types of slave board games and things like. Don't do that stuff. They talk about how it's traumatizing to students, especially African American students. I just heard a story in the last couple of weeks. It wasn't a slave. It wasn't a slave board game. There was another dumbass story about that. I've covered that. A slave board game, running away to freedom. But this was another one. This was an assignment. I may have to do a separate broadcast on this. This was an assignment in the school, and it was something to the effect of it was asking the children, would you want to be a slave master or a slave? Something to that effect. Something stupid. But read this, Teaching Hard History of American Slavery. Okay? All right, where are we here? Oh, racism, white supremacy. Okay, so this ties into preserving genetic white survival. This ties into sex. This is why we saw lynchings used so much as a tool of terrorism, specifically against African American men. When we study Ida B. Wells, Ida B. Wells got involved in the anti-lynching movement because of the Moss store murders in 1892 in Memphis, Tennessee. And her friends, Tom Moss and two of his friends, they were killed when their store, and let me see if I've got, where's my information on Ida B. Wells? Get that information because I deal with this in my lecture on Great African Women in History, the Mothers of Civilization. Let me see if I can find that info. Okay, I think that's in I think that info on Ida B. Wells is in another file folder. All right, but anyway, so what happens is Tom Moss was a grocery store owner, and he was a postman in Memphis, Tennessee, and he had a successful grocery store. And there was a white grocery store owner, I think, across the street, who was jealous of him because Tom Moss was taking away this white grocery store's customers, like the African American customers. So one night he sends the white grocery store owner sends some of his friends who are off-duty sheriff deputies, and he sends them to trash Tom Moss's store. Okay. Well, Tom Moss is there with his friends, and they're armed, so they shoot these off-duty sheriff deputies. They don't know they're sheriff deputies, but they shoot them, and they're going to be arrested. Blackden.com has a good article dealing with this. Moss Store Murders, M-O-S-S, Moss Store Murders, the tragedy that inspired Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching crusade. In March of 1892, Ida B. Wells, a journalist and former Memphis school teacher, started a crusade against lynching after 3 friends of hers were brutally murdered by a Memphis mob. Tom Moss, M-O-S-S, and 2 of his friends, Calvin McDowell and Henry Stewart, were arrested for defending themselves against an attack on Moss store. Tom Moss was a highly respected figure in the African American community, a postman, as well as the owner of the grocery store. It's called the People's Grocery Store. A white competitor, enraged that Tom Moss had drawn away his black customers, hired some off-duty sheriffs to destroy the store. Tom Moss and his friends, not knowing the men were deputies, resisted. A gun battle broke out, and several deputies were wounded. Tom Moss and his 2 friends and 100 other African American supporters were arrested. Several nights later, masked vigilantes dragged Tom Moss and his 2 friends from their cells, took them to a deserted railroad yard and shot them to death. Enraged by their deaths, Ida B. Wells lashed out at the refusal of Memphis police to arrest the well-known killers. She encouraged African Americans to protest with boycotts of white-owned stores and public transportation, economic boycotts. So this is one of the things that needs to happen now. We need to have massive economic boycotts. I'm going to have to do a separate broadcast, okay, dealing with this. We have to have targeted, sustained, nationwide economic boycotts. Dr. King, April 3rd, 1968, in his last speech, I've been to the mountaintop, he talked about how, redistribute the pain. And redistribute the pain, he wasn't talking about violence. What he was talking about was targeted, sustained economic withdrawal strategies. And he was speaking to the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And here we go with Memphis again. In Memphis, Tennessee. And he called on them to have economic boycotts of Coca-Cola, Wonder Bread, Hart's Bread, and Seal Test Milk for their discriminatory hiring practices. And when we study the civil rights movement, we see elements that we can use today. See, a lot of people think it was just marching. No, it wasn't marching. Mass protests played a purpose. They had a part. The mass protests help draw attention to the problem, help you inform people about the problem, help you galvanize support around the problem, and bring people into your movement. That's mass protest. Okay? Marching and mass protest is a tactic to use. It's part of a strategy, but it's not the strategy. It's not the plan. They also use targeted, sustained economic boycotts as well. They also had legal strategies also. So a lot of people today think that they accomplished what they did by marching. That was a tactic as part of a larger strategy. Marching can be, mass protests and marching can be a tactic, but it is not the overall, it's not the total strategy, it's not the total plan. And at the end of each one of these marches, at the end of these protests that take place, march yourself down to black-owned businesses and buy them out. That ties in an economic empowerment component to this. People spend all this time protesting and things like this, and then they just disband. Or what they'll do is like they did in Chicago after the tape of Laquan McDonald was released, when Laquan McDonald was shot and killed. And they held the tape until Mayor Rahm Emanuel was reelected. And I told people when I was doing nationally syndicated radio, I told you need to vote Rahm Emanuel out of office. You got the votes. And in that primary that took place, that first reelection, that primary that took place, there were 700,000 African Americans registered to vote, and only 150,000 voted. And I said, you need to vote his ass out of office. And they didn't vote him out of office. He got reelected. Then he released the tape, and people in Chicago, black people in Chicago, went crazy, and they're out in the streets demanding that he resign. I said, why didn't you vote him out of office when you had the chance? That's another conversation. Okay. But there were protests up and down the Magnificent Mile, Michigan Avenue in Chicago, where you had all the department stores and things like this, and African Americans standing in front of the stores, blocking the entrance and everything. And I'm looking at them watching this, and I say, I sure hope they're redirecting these people to go spend money in black-owned businesses. Because oftentimes we'll take pride in standing in front of a white business, blocking commerce and blocking the entrance. But we don't redirect that energy and redirect those bodies to go down to black businesses and spend money with them. So this is why when two of my teachers, Dr. Leonard Jeffries and Professor James Small, talk about the pyramid principle, and the foundation of the pyramid is African history and culture, which gives us our values, our interests, and our principles. It gives us our VIPs, and it gives us our self-esteem, our self-determination, our self-worth, our self-value, etc. But it influences how we engage in economics also. The two sides of the pyramid are economic empowerment and political empowerment. So many of us will take pride in standing in front of a white-owned store, blocking commerce and blocking the entrance. But at the same time, we're not redirecting all that energy to send them down to African-American-owned stores to spend money and invest in African-American-owned businesses. So we have to change our thinking. So when we have these mass protests, right? Mass protests have a purpose. Now at the end of the march, at the end of the protest, march yourself down to black-owned businesses and spend dollars with them and buy them out. Don't loot them. Buy them out. Redirect that energy to help support our businesses as well. Because those businesses are the ones most likely to support us and employ us. And they may also contribute to your effort as well. But we're not thinking from that perspective. We think push-pull. Push-pull. So we think, okay, we're going to have a national blackout day where we ain't going to spend no money. Why the hell would you do something like that? Why wouldn't you have National Black End Day where you spend money with black businesses? We think push-pull, push-pull. Not redirect energy and flip them. Not understanding principles of political martial arts like jiu-jitsu or aikido. It's just tug of war. Okay. Who's the troll? Let me know, because I'll get rid of a troll. I've got trolls in different area codes. But I will get rid of a troll. All right, so let's continue here. And let me see. The internet was down on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, so let's see if we can... let's see if we can play any of these clips here. I may have to do a separate broadcast. I had some clips that I wanted you to hear. So we'll try to get this one up here, Dr. King. All right, so the mosque store murders, right? Also, if you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, $, the AHN Show through Cash App, $, the AHN Show through Cash App. Also through PayPal, paypal.me, paypal.me/the AHN Show. And let's do PayPal, okay? Or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, okay? And that helps us to keep doing the research, finance our Sunday night show, everything, all right? And we have orders shipping out this week also. My lectures are at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Okay, let's continue here. So Tom Moss and his friends, not knowing the men were deputies, resisted. A gun battle broke out and several deputies were wounded. Tom Moss and his two friends and 100 other African-American supporters were arrested. Several nights later, mass vigilantes dragged Tom Moss and his two friends from their cells, took them to a deserted railroad, and shot them to death. All right. Now, as I stated at the beginning of the show, and I was in downtown Detroit and saw the protests, and I'm talking, to white people. Now, they probably meant well. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on them. But as I said before, see, I wasn't going to the protests. I don't know who's organizing it. And I'm a historian, and I haven't heard of too many stories where white people with masks and the story turned out well for black people. I'm just saying. I know they're well-meaning white people that were there. Don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying. Hey, hold on, man. I ain't going to this. I don't know who's organizing this protest. I ain't going to be up in there. Not the kid. We ain't doing that. So, all right. So this is an example, right? Several nights later, mass vigilantes dragged Tom Moss and his two friends from their cells, took them to a deserted railroad yard, and shot them to death. Okay? I'm not saying these white people had ill intentions. It's just saying I don't know you like that. All right, so enraged by their deaths, Ida B. Wells lashed out at the refusal of Memphis police to arrest the well-known killers. She encouraged African Americans to protest with boycotts of white-owned stores and public transportation. The lynchings were a turning point in Ida B. Wells' life. She began to investigate and reveal the real motivation that lay behind lynching. Like many middle-class African Americans, Ida B. Wells had accepted the myth that, pay attention to this, like many middle-class African Americans at the time, we're talking about 1898, Ida B. Wells had accepted the myth that only poor African Americans were lynched for heinous crimes. Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist, newspaper owner, newspaper writer, Ida B. Wells investigated the reasons for lynchings. She discovered that a number of victims were lynched not for rape, but for having sexual relations with consenting white women. She in her investigation, she found out that a lot of these victims, a lot of these African American men who were victims of lynching were not victims of rape. Even though people said it was rape, a lot of this was consensual sex between African American men and white women. And their husband, the white woman's husband, found out, father found out, brother found out, what have cousins, what have you, and they lynched them. Go look at what happened with Emmett Till. Emmett Till said to Carolyn Bryant in Money, Mississippi, said bye baby to her. She goes and lies to her husband about everything that happened. Roy Bryant and her brother-in-law J.W. Millen go to Emmett Till's, I think it was his grandfather's house, kidnap him, torture him, and kill him. Okay? That was August of 1955. When you see, Ida B. Wells did this research, and she found out this was about sex. It wasn't about rape. This was about sex. So, Ida B. Wells investigated the reasons for lynching. She discovered that a number of victims were lynched not for rape, but for having sexual relations with consenting white women. Quote, nobody in this section of the community believes that old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. If Southern men are not careful, a conclusion might be reached which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. End quote. This is what she wrote, okay, in a newspaper, in like the editorials that she wrote. But the suggestion that white women would willingly have sexual relations with African American men enraged white Memphis, enraged white people in Memphis, Tennessee. Since Ida B. Wells did not sign her name to her editorials, the white press assumed that a man had written the article. The Memphis Scimitar, SCIMITAR, advocated a violent response. This is the white newspaper there. They wrote, quote, it will be the duty of those whom he has attacked time to stake brand his forehead with a hot iron and perform a heinous act on him. This is what they wrote in the newspaper. A mob destroyed Ida B. Wells' newspaper while Ida B. Wells was out of town, and she was forced to remain in the North. Ida B. Wells launched a national crusade against the lynching that would capture the attention of the nation and Europe. Okay, read this article from blackden.com. PBS.org has another one, because I deal with Ida B. Wells in my lecture series dealing with great African women in history, the mothers of civilization. Read this article from blackden.com. Moss, M-O-S-S, Moss Store Murders, the tragedy that inspired Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching crusade. Okay, let me post this link here, and I want to go to this clip here, Dr. King. And what I'm going to do throughout the week, we're going to do some other broadcasting with this. You know, I had Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist of Michigan on at the beginning of my show, so that threw things off. I've got a lot of information, and I want to get through this information, but it ain't going to be all today, I'm telling you now. All right, it's been a very busy, and I haven't spoken on this at all. I've posted about it, but the killing of George Floyd, I haven't spoken on it, because I was too angry, I was too pissed off to talk, and I didn't want to come off sounding crazy. Let me just leave it at that. So sometimes I just know just to be quiet until I calm down. But I think what's going to happen, I think you're going to see that it's something like, first of all, the young sister who did the recording, she's 17 years old, she's traumatized. We thank her for what she did. The people who were there, who were witnesses, we thank them as well. But I think you're going to see, if something like that happens again, I think you're going to have African Americans who in various ways are going to intervene in various ways to break that up. And I don't necessarily mean violently, you know, however they however they see fit, it's their call. I'm not calling for violence, but I think you're going to have people who will intervene. I was listening to Reverend Al Sharpton's radio show, because he's on 910 a.m. the Superstation WFDF, Monday through Friday, 9 p.m. to Monday through Friday, 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. It's nationally syndicated radio show, Keeping It Real. And he was asked a question, if he was there, what he would do. He said he would go up to the police officers and tell them, you can't do that, and if you're going to arrest somebody, you know, arrest me. But he said he would tell them to arrest him before he would just stand by and be compliant with that. Okay, and I think you would have people that would come and intervene, you know, in various ways with that as well, to break that up. Okay, so let's see here. Can we get this clip to play? All right, I'm gonna try to cue this clip up. This is Dr. King in 1966, talking about rebellions, talking about riots. All right, so we'll try to get this clip queued up. So just give me a minute here. All right, so we talked about white supremacy and racism. Racism being a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race, coming out of the ideology of white supremacy. They're understanding how all this deals with, bottom line deals with sex. Is the race that has the highest concentration of melanin, they get the brunt of racism. They have the greatest potential of genetically wiping out white people off the face of the earth. I'm not talking about violence, I'm talking about biology. And because it's the man who usually imposes sex, the man who has the highest concentration of melanin gets the brunt of racism. This also ties into a history of slavery as well, but we see this during slavery also. But all this, see, the transatlantic slave trade, if you understand history chronologically, the transatlantic slave trade is really white people getting revenge on Africans for what happened with the Moors in Europe. It's a continuum. It's not just, we look at it as, okay, this starts in 1441 with the Portuguese going into Mauritania, picking up Africans. That may be the start of a new phase, but it's a continuum of the conflict that was already taking place. Most people don't understand that background history. Okay? You got to understand that 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors to understand the transatlantic slave trade and what was going on there. Because when you go look at the Spanish, and the Spanish are setting up colonies, and you look at things like King Charles V and the Asiento de Negros, 1518. When the Spanish are setting up colonies, one of the things they're doing is making it illegal for the Europeans to intermix with the African slaves and have children. Because they saw what happened for hundreds of years in Spain when the Moors intermixing with Europeans. You're going to see these various colonies, these various European colonies set up these different laws. Now, you're going to have white men that violate them a lot. But you're going to have, but they were largely set up to keep black men, African men, from having sex with white women. Why? Because that's what was happening in Europe. For hundreds of years. All right. How's everybody doing? Let me try to get this clip queued up here. Let's see what we're dealing with. We'll do other broadcasts here. Okay, this is from 60 Minutes. Let's try to go here.
There is an increasingly vocal minority who disagreed totally with your tactics, Dr. King.
There's no doubt about that. I would agree that there is a group in the Negro community advocating violence now. I happen to feel that this group represents a numerical minority. Surveys have revealed this. The vast majority of Negroes still feel that the best way to deal with the dilemma that we face in this country is through nonviolent resistance. And I don't think this vocal group will be able to make a real dent in the Negro community in terms of swaying 22 million Negroes to this particular point of view. And I contend that the cry of black power is at bottom a reaction to the reluctance of white power to make the kind of changes necessary to make justice a reality for the Negro. I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years.
How many summers like this one do you imagine that we can expect?
Well, I would say this: we don't have long. The mood of the Negro community now is one of urgency, one of saying that we aren't going to wait, that we've got to have our freedom. We've waited too long. So that I would say that every summer we are going to have this kind of vigorous protest. My hope is that it will be nonviolent. I would hope that we can avoid riots because riots are self-defeating and socially destructive. I would hope that we can avoid riots, but that we will be as militant and as determined next summer and through the winter as we have been this summer. And I think the answer about how long it will take will depend on the federal government, on the city halls of our various cities, and on white America to a large extent. This is where we are at this point, and I think white America will determine how long it will be and which way we go in the future.
Even Senator Jacob Javits asked the question recently. He said that he was a slum resident, but he and some of his fellow Jews were able to make it out of the ghetto on the Lower East Side. The same thing is true with lots of Irish, Italians. And he asked the question why the Negro finds it so difficult to make his way up out of the ghetto.
Well, number one, no other racial group has been a slave on American soil. It's nice to say other people were down and they got up. They were not slaves on American soil. The other thing is that the Negro has had high visibility. And because of the prejudices existing in this country, his color has been against him. It's been against him, and they've used this to keep him from moving up. In the final analysis, when you say to a man that you are in this position because of your race or because of your color, you say to that man that he can never get out of it. Other racial groups have been able maybe to change the accent or change the names, but the Negro can't.
All right, that was our brother. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. breaking it down. That was from September 27th, 1966. Dr. King was interviewed on 60 Minutes by Mike Wallace. I'm going to post a link here to that interview, and it has the transcript of that. We need to study that because a riot is the language of the unheard. He's correct there. But also, this was 66, 67, July 28, 1967, the Kerner Commission is convened that I talked about earlier in the show. If we go study the results of the Kerner Commission, those are things that we can get pushed through Congress once Trump gets out of office. If you look at, and we're going to get to this next week, you know, each week I'm dealing with one plank of Joe Biden's policies for the African American community. Okay. Last week we dealt with, where is it here? Last week we dealt with, let's see, week 1 we dealt with economics. Last week we dealt with education. And part 3 is in 6 parts. Part 3 deals with health disparities. Make far-reaching investments in ending health disparities. Okay. I'm gonna go through this briefly. Go read this. All this in his agenda ties directly into what's going on right now. Go to joebiden.com, read this. This is not an endorsement, but all of this deals with policies, laws, politics, and directly deals with every aspect of our lives. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. This is what politics is. Yeah, Dr. King was talking about the Black Power movement because the term Black Power was first used basically, I think it was June 1966. That was during the March Against Fear in Mississippi. And it was Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. Okay. That was either June or July 1960. I think it was June 1966. This interview was from September 27th, 1966. So he's talking about the Black Power movement. And in Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, chapter 2 is called Black Power, and he deals with the Black Power movement. And Dr. King was friends. It was the two that came up with the term Black Power, Kwame Ture and Mukasa Dada. Okay, Willie Ricks, Mukasa Dada. So Dr. King uses the term Black Power, but then he backs away from the term because he says power has no color. But the overall ideology of the Black Power movement in general, he supported. So read, I'm looking for my copy. Yeah, read Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, by Dr. King. Yeah, right here. This was his last book. Dr. King wrote 5 books. Unfortunately, we haven't studied Dr. King and just disgraced his legacy. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And chapter 2 is called Black Power. James Meredith had been shot. This is page 23. James Meredith had been shot. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday in June 1966, and I was presiding over the regular staff meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in our Atlanta headquarters when we heard that James Meredith had been shot in the back only a day after he had begun his freedom march through Mississippi. There was a momentary hush of anger and dismay throughout the room. Our horror was compounded by the fact that the early reports announced that James Meredith was dead. Soon the silence was broken, and from every corner of the room came expression of outrage. The business of the meeting was forgotten in the shock of the latest evidence that a Negro's life is still worthless in many parts of his own country. When order was finally restored, our executive staff immediately agreed that the march must continue. After all, we reasoned, James Meredith had begun his lonely journey as a pilgrimage against fear. Wouldn't failure to continue only intensify the fears of the oppressed and deprived Negroes of Mississippi? Would this not be a setback for the whole civil rights movement and a blow to nonviolent discipline? After several calls between Atlanta and Memphis, we learned that the early reports of James Meredith's death were false and that he would recover. The news brought relief, but it did not alter our feeling that the civil rights movement had a moral obligation to continue along the path that James Meredith had begun. The next morning, I was off to Memphis, Tennessee, along with several members of my staff. Floyd McKenzie, National Director of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, flew in from New York and joined us on the flight from Atlanta to Memphis. After landing, we went directly to the municipal hospital to visit James Meredith. Okay, so what they did was they continued the march against fear. This is in Mississippi. I think this was in Mississippi, and Kwame Ture was there. Stokely Carmichael joined it. Okay, as we prepared to leave. Okay, there at the hospital. As we prepared to leave, the nurse came to the door and said, "Mr. Meredith, there is a Mr. Carmichael in the lobby who would like to see you and Dr. King. Should I give him permission to come in?" James Meredith consented. Stokely Carmichael entered with his associate Cleveland Sellers and immediately reached out for James Meredith's hand. He expressed his concern and admiration and brought messages of sympathy from his colleagues in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. After a brief conversation, we all agreed that James Meredith should get some rest and that we should not burden him with any additional talk. We left the room assuring him that we would conduct the march in his spirit and would seek as never before to expose the ugly racism that pervaded Mississippi and to arouse a new sense of dignity and manhood in every Negro who inhabited that bastion of man's inhumanity to man. In a brief conference, Floyd McKenzie, Stokely Carmichael, and I agreed the march would be jointly sponsored by CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, with the understanding that all other civil rights organizations would be invited to join. It was also agreed that we would issue a national call for support and participation. Okay, so this is talking about the March Against Fear. So what's going to happen is during the march they get arrested. Let's skip over to page 26. At the end of the march that first day, we all went back to Memphis, Tennessee and spent the night in a Negro motel since we had not yet secured the tents, T-E-N-T-S, tents, that would serve as shelter each of the following nights on our journey. The discussion continued at the motel. I decided that I would plead patiently with my brothers to remain true to the time-honored principles of our movement. I began with a plea for nonviolence. This is Dr. King talking. This immediately aroused some of our friends from the Deacons for Defense and Justice, right? Because Dr. King oftentimes used Deacons for Defense and Justice as his security or for security for civil rights workers, and CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, was a civil rights group that probably used the Deacons for Defense and Justice the most, okay? So, read this book right here. This is probably the preeminent book on the history of the Deacons for Defense and Justice. Deacons for Defense, Armed Resistance, and the Civil Rights Movement. Read this book. And you have to read this book here. This is by, okay, so this one on Deacons for Defense and Justice, this is by Lance Hill. This book right here, Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr., This Nonviolent Stuff That Gets You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. This book right here tells the real history of the Civil Rights Movement and how it was not a nonviolent movement. I'm not talking about vigilantism. I'm talking about African Americans defending themselves using guns to protect themselves. Dr. King owned guns until Bayard Rustin convinced him to get rid of his guns. Dr. King tried to get a concealed pistol license in January 1956 in Montgomery, Alabama. Okay, he was denied a concealed pistol license. So we really don't, a lot of people really, I hear people talk about the Civil Rights Movement and all this stuff. A lot of people really don't understand the history of the Civil Rights Movement. It was ostensibly nonviolent, but it was African Americans, it was Negroes. If it had not been for Negroes with guns, there would not have been a Civil Rights Movement. Professor James Small told me personally, the Civil Rights Movement was not a nonviolent movement. And that's what this book right here documents. Okay? Rosa Parks and her husband had guns. Fannie Lou Hamer had guns. Medgar Evers, Dr. King. These people weren't stupid. Come on. You go back and study Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, after the Mostor murder, Ida B. Wells wrote in the newspaper, she said, every Negro house should have a Winchester rifle in the house to protect themselves. All right, let's continue here. Okay, so I began with a plea for nonviolence. This immediately aroused some of our friends from the Deacons for Defense and Justice, who contended that self-defense was essential and that therefore nonviolence should not be a prerequisite for participation in the march. They were joined in this view by some of the activists from CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I tried to make it clear that besides opposing violence on principle, I could imagine nothing more impractical and disastrous than for any of us, through misguided judgment, to precipitate a violent confrontation in Mississippi. We had neither the resources nor the techniques to win. Furthermore, I asserted many Mississippi whites from the government on down would enjoy nothing more than for us to turn to violence in order to use this as an excuse to wipe out scores of Negroes and in and out of the march. Finally, I contended that the debate over the question of self-defense was unnecessary, since few people suggested that Negroes should not defend themselves as individuals when attacked. The question was not whether one should use his gun when his home was attacked, but whether it was tactically wise to use a gun while participating in an organized demonstration. If they lowered the banner of nonviolence, I said Mississippi injustice would not be exposed and the moral issues would be obscured. Next, the question of the participation of whites was raised. White people in the March Against Fear, June of 1966 in Mississippi. Stokely Carmichael contended that the inclusion of whites in the march should be de-emphasized and that the dominant appeal should be made for black participation. Others in the room agreed. As I listened to Stokely, I thought about the years that we had worked together in communities all across the South, and how joyously we had then welcomed and accepted our white allies in the movement. What accounted for this reversal in Stokely's philosophy? I surmised that much of the change had its psychological roots in the experience of SNCC in Mississippi during the summer of 1964, when a large number of northern white students had come down to help in the racially torn state. What the SNCC workers saw was the more articulate, powerful, and self-assured young white people coming to work with the poorest of the Negro people and simply overwhelming them. That summer, Stokely and others in SNCC had probably unconsciously concluded that this was no good for Negroes, for it simply increased their sense of their own inadequacies. Of course, the answer to this dilemma was not to give up, not to conclude that blacks must work with blacks in order for Negroes to gain a sense of their own meaning. The answer was only to be found in persistent trying, perpetual experimentation, preserving togetherness. Okay, so then they go on finally. Okay, they go on and talk about. I think they talk about the march, because what happens is they get arrested. They go on a march against fear. They get arrested, and coming out of jail, Kwame Ture Stokely Carmichael gives a speech, and he talks about what we want is black power. We want black power. And this is like the first time he talked about black power publicly, and it blew everybody away. Let's see here. If you watch the so this is from chapter 2 of Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. If you watch this 6-part series that Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. did on PBS back in 2012 called African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, there's a segment in there where they deal with the March Against Fear. And they have, they show Stokely Carmichael talking about what we want is black power. And Henry Louis Gates, who I disagree with on some things, Gates said that when he saw this at home in his living room, it just totally blew him away. Okay, and it blew a lot of people away, a lot of African Americans across the country when they saw that. Okay, all right. So let's do this here. Let me just go over this briefly here, because I'm still on page 1 of my notes. Okay, and I have all these articles here. So I'm going to do other broadcasts. I'm still on page 1. I've got basically like 3 pages of notes here. But this is what I want to do. Let's see. Okay, let's shift gears here. And a lot of this other stuff I have to do subsequent broadcasts on. Laura Ingraham on Fox News, we posted the article. Laura Ingraham said that Donald Trump understands police brutality because of the way that he was treated by the FBI. She said to the African American community, go read that article I posted from rawstory.com. Laura Ingraham on Fox News, this idiot, she said to the African American community, Donald Trump understands how you feel about police brutality because of the way he was treated by the FBI with the Mueller investigation. All right. Go to JoeBiden.com, read Joe Biden's policies for the African American community. Part 3, I printed it out, it's 23 pages. Part 3 deals with make far-reaching investments in ending health disparities by race. Okay? And I'm going to deal with just a couple things here. So they talk about COVID-19, some of the bullet points: ensuring access to health care during this crisis, ensure access to affordable, high-quality health care beyond the crisis, reducing the uninsured rate for African Americans by creating a public option health plan. Nationally, 11% of non-elderly African Americans are uninsured compared to 8% of whites. This disparity is far greater in states with Republican governors who have not expanded Medicaid. Each one of these bullet points, there's a deeper explanation. Okay, I don't have time to get into all this. Reducing the uninsured rate for African Americans by creating a public option health plan, improving care for patients with chronic conditions, lowering costs for African Americans enrolled in Obamacare plans, lowering drug prices, reducing our unacceptably high African American maternal mortality rate. Maternal mortality rate: African American women are 2.5 times more likely to die from pregnancy complications than non-Hispanic white women. Expanding access to reproductive health care, including contraception, and protecting the Constitution. Doubling the nation's investment in community health centers, expanding access to mental health care, tackling social detriments of health. Another main heading: invest in the diverse talent of historically black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions to solve the country's most pressing problems, including health disparities. Disparities. As part of Biden's more than $70 billion investment in HBCUs and MSIs. MSIs are minority serving institutions. He will invest $10 billion to create at least 200 new centers of excellence that serve as research incubators and connect students underrepresented in fields critical to our nation's future to learning and career opportunities. So there's more to that. Read the rest of that. Then they talk about build a diverse pipeline of healthcare professionals by investing in healthcare graduate programs at HBCUs and MSIs, minority serving institutions. As part of Biden's more than $70 billion investment in HBCUs and MSIs, he will invest $5 billion in graduate programs in healthcare, along with teaching and STEM at HBCUs and MSIs. Okay, go read through this, and then we have the article from. If you read the article from Black Press USA, Joe Biden's plan for empowering Black America. Joe Biden's plan for empowering Black America, May 5th, 2020. BlackPressUSA.com. We'll post the link here, and it lays out the 6 bullet points, 6 main parts of Joe Biden's plan for Black America. And one of the things it says here is Joe Biden said that the plan reflects many months of work and feedback from local elected officials, activists, organizations, practitioners, policy experts, strategists, and young people. His campaign called the plan a living document. They're going to expand this. Simone Sanders has talked about how they're looking for feedback from this. Go read this. In a news release, the campaign noted that Biden, quote, knows we need a comprehensive agenda for African Americans with an ambition that matches the scale of the challenge and with a recognition that race-neutral policies are not a sufficient response to race-based disparities. So the Biden plan is broken into 6 parts. Part 1, advance the economic mobility of African Americans and close the racial wealth and income gaps. We dealt with that March 17th. Go watch the March 17th show. Part 2, expand access to high quality education and tackle racial inequity in our education system. We dealt with that last week's show. That's the May 24th show. Third part, make far-reaching investments in ending health disparities by race. That's what I highlighted just now. Fourth part, strengthen America's commitment to justice. That deals with criminal justice reform. We'll deal with that next week. Fifth part, make the right to vote and the right to equal protection real for African Americans. We'll deal with that in the subsequent week. And then the last part, address environmental justice. Environmental justice is huge. Okay. Okay, so read this also from Black Press USA, and then at the end of this article, it has the link to Joe Biden's plan, his policies for the African American community. Read that, but then also read his entire policy platform. I've read his entire policy platform because I did the broadcast March 10th that looked at a comparison between the Democratic candidates and their policies for the African American community. And I looked at the comparison that the Root.com did based upon their policy matrix that they put together, their 10-point policy matrix. Then I did another broadcast April 26th after Biden became the presumptive nominee, and he was endorsed by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and President Barack Obama, things like that. And he had expanded his policy platform, and he added highlights to an upcoming black agenda, specific agenda for African Americans. So he first put the highlights on his website. Then May 5th, 2020, released the full 22, 23-page agenda. I encourage everybody to read it, hear a whole lot of people talking about it, talking around it. I listened to them until they have not read it. It's very in general, it's very detailed, and this is a living document, so they're going to expand it as well. Usually with campaigns, as the campaign progresses, they expand their agendas, because I go to their websites and read them. Okay. All right, so hey, if you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, $ the AHN Show through Cash App, $ the AHN Show through Cash App, or through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN Show, paypal.me/the AHN Show. Thanks, Abba, for your donation. Appreciate that, Sister Abba. PayPal.me/the AHN Show through PayPal, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. And all of my DVD lectures are at our website, African History Network, as well. AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Follow me on my Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network. Okay, and read their articles we post daily. I'm busy working. I can't do as many broadcasts throughout the week as I want to. I'm trying to squeeze in one between Sunday shows. All right, and follow me on my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP, on YouTube as well. Subscribe to Facebook and YouTube. Turn on notifications so you know when I go live. Also, sign up for our email newsletter. Text the word Kemet, K-E-M-E-T. Text the word Kemet, K-E-M-E-T, to 22828 to sign up for our email newsletter as well. So I send out the email newsletter 2 or 3 times throughout the week. All right. Okay, so hey, look, we have to get out of here. Remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world. Because right now it's correct wrong behavior. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. Remember, right now it's correct wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. And we'll talk to you next time. Peace.